Padera sucked on her lips a moment. She was his property, and Iva could do what he wanted. Never crossed Rihanna's mind that anyone might help. If she had come to me, things would have turned out different, but she was scared, and I was the last person she would trust. Like I said, I lived the closest, and Iva was a clever man. He told Rihanna I was a witch, and that I would just as likely eat her as help her. She gave Gifford a long accusing stare. I've caught up to them, and he beat Rihanna to death. While Ron watched, he took Roan on a trip and disposed of the body. When they got back, Iva told everyone Rihanna had died in childbirth. They offered condolences, but he acted like he didn't care, because she had been just a slave. Folks thought he was in denial, his way of dealing with grief. It wasn't. Gifford leaned on the table, trying to remain calm. She's just trying to get into my head. So you really the witch, you know what I mean? Gifford couldn't bring himself to say the name. Even though there were no R sounds in it, he couldn't say it. Not standing so close. You're asking if I'm the Tetling witch? He nodded. What if I were? What would you do? He didn't say anything. He honestly didn't know. Won't you call me out? Get the neighbors to tie me to some pile of last year's firewood and burn me to death. He still didn't say anything. He'd never liked Padera. She'd always been cruel to him while being kind to everyone else, which was worse than if she'd been mean to everyone. She once tried to explain it as some sort of twisted tough love that filled him with guilt over his mother's death. He'd believed her, but now he didn't know what to think. If she really was the witch who knew what she was up to, still he didn't want to kill her. He didn't want to hurt her. If he were honest with himself, which for Gifford was usually a very painful experience, he'd have to admit he respected the old woman. He couldn't even find fault in her killing either, had he known what was happening. Jeffrey would have tried to kill the woodcarver himself. That's what they do to witches, you know. Padera went back to cutting mushrooms. With nothing else to do or say, Gifford watched as those old hands chopped with generations of experience. You want to know about the Tetling witch, so I'll tell you. There was a terrible plague, a horrible sickness. Padera set her head down, focusing on her work. Killed thousands, wiped out whole communities. One woman who had learned the art of herbs and roots from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before her, stretching all the way back to the old country, the one beyond the sea, discovered how to combat the eldest. Only she wasn't a chieftain or a man or even a mother. She had no standing in the community, and no one listened, no one trusted her. The plague came and killed everyone in the village of Tetlin, everyone but her. She went to other villages and tried to tell them how to survive. They didn't listen either, and each village she visited was wiped out by the plague. Shortly after her arrival, people got it into their heads that she wasn't trying to stop the sickness, that instead she was causing it. She was a witch. They said they hung her to death in a forest where she went to hide. She sadly shook her head. That, my boy, is the real story of the Tetlin witch, not as spectacular as the others you've no doubt heard over cups in the lodge. And of course the story didn't end there, because the Tetling witch wasn't the only woman with a mind, with knowledge and skills. Women who refused to fit in, who didn't act the way others thought they should, who embarrassed those in power with their wisdom or knowledge. They too were declared to be the Tetling, which we all know that the Tetling witch is evil in some cases. These unfortunate women were merely driven away, but some, like that original wise woman from a little village named Tetlin, were killed. A lot of women have suffered, still suffer, for the crime of knowing what others don't or doing what others can't. Turns out the Tetlin witch is everywhere, and she in all her forms is the real plague. Padera finished the last of her mushrooms, and scooping them into her hand, she looked at him with both eyes. So yes, Gifford, I am the Tetling witch, and the same goes for Rihanna, Roan, Moyer, Bryn, Persephone, and sorry, not to mention a great many more. So call them mobs to kill me or leave me alone. I don't have time for your foolishness. Gifford lived in Hopeless House at the end of the stone alley across the square from Roan's cottage, the one she was supposed to share with Bryn and Padera, but rarely visited. The name Hopeless House came from the fact that Gifford, Hubbard, Matthias, and Gelston lived there. The cripple, the slow, the old, and the unlucky, all tucked neatly under one roof. Gifford was the one who named it, learning from experience. It was better to stay out ahead of ridicule, to choose his own insults, rather than leave it to others. Not that he thought people would choose worse, but if left to the public, then the mockery became one more thing done to him. This way they could still laugh, But it was his joke he found Tressa sitting on the porch steps. When he came up the alley, she was an unofficial member of Hopeless House. The only reason Tressa wasn't bunking with them was because she was a woman, otherwise she'd fit right into their league of misery. Her unofficial Hopeless House title would have been The Hated. "How's he doing?" Gifford asked. Tressa had a ceramic jug on her lap, hugging it to her chest. Her hair was a mess of snarls, and the sleeves on her dress were decorated with dingy brown stains. She looked up with a pair of sour lips that seemed a bit like Pedera's, only with teeth behind them. "I don't know," she said. Her voice had become raspy, just as worn as the rest of her. "Some days she seems better, you know. The old bastard gets my hopes up." And then the next day she spat between her feet. Tressa was a good spitter, better than Gifford. It was one of the things he admired about her. Gifford made a practice of finding something to admire about everyone. Not terribly hard, since for him the ability to stand straight was a source of awe. "I take it this is the next day." She looked over the top of the jug at him with a smirk. "Oh, bastard, didn't even know who I was, just stared at me. I thought that was why you helped Gilston." "What made him so appealing?" "Because he couldn't remember you." She nodded, but it was a slow, sad nod. "I come over here every day, and I feed him, bathe him, wash his clothes, clean his backside. And we talk for hours, he and I, about stupid stuff like hats and snowflakes. And why the gods hate us sometimes." He smiles when he sees me come in. But yesterday Tressa sucked in an abrupt breath and held it with mashed lips. She stayed that way for a second, then let it out slowly, carefully. "Yesterday he rushed right over and gave me a hug." She halted again and swallowed twice, a real tight "I love you" kind of hug, you know. She glanced at Gifford and shook her head. "Okay, so maybe you don't know, but it was nice, real nice, not romantic, nothing like that, just appreciation, love. I hadn't been hugged like that." And she looked up at the sky and took a few more deep breaths through her nose. "And then today, it's like that never happened. He's a stranger again." She hooked her thumb in the jug and tilted it up to her lips. "Want some?" Coming off the neck of the jug, her breath was an invisible cloud of fermented rye. "Number, thanks, it helps, trust me, it helps, thank you." But no. Tressa nodded and wiped her mouth. She also deftly wiped her eyes, trying to clear the wetness on her lashes. Without him seeing, he pretended not to. "Did you manage to have your picnic?" He nodded. She stared. "Didn't go well, huh? No, any other man would have given up on her by now. If I was anyone else, I wouldn't have to." Tessa laughed. "Is that what you think? You think she's the catch? In this pairing, Roan would fit right in here at Hopeless House home. But honestly, that girl is messed up. She won't even let you touch her." "Well, she won't let anyone." "How's that gonna work, do you think? I mean, even if you pull off some miracle and get her to marry you, what kind of marriage will that be? When you can't touch your own wife for Morris's sake, you can't even hold hands, can you not, without Wayne screaming?" Tressa shook her head and held the jug to him again. "You sure?" He shook his head. "Bowen has reasons. We all have our reasons." Tressa took another pull from the jug. "Maureen knows we all have our reasons." Chapter 9. The Pottery Man. "Heroes are those who refuse to create or become victims. I failed to see it then, but I lived among many heroes. I think maybe everyone does." The Book of Bryn, balancing on the railing of the Spy Rock balcony, with her arms opened wide. Siri, imagine she was flying. Wasn't that hard? The world spread out below her, and the wind was so strong it watered her eyes. For the first time she wished she had longer hair, just so she could feel it blow. "Having fun?" Orion asked, but Suri heard. "Are you insane? You're scaring me to death." That was happening a lot. Suri had always received messages from a land, from trees, the weather, and animals. What she had believed to be mystic talent had been the art whispering, intuition, premonition. A sense of oneness with the world was all the result of her gift for hearing the language of creation. Most people heard its calm moments of unexplained dread before a tragedy, inexplicable coincidences, or a sense of destiny were all faint signals sent from a land. No one was entirely deaf, but few had the ability to understand what they were told. Even fewer could hold a conversation. While not as strong as Suri, Torah must have also had a talent for the art. All genuine mystics and seers had at least a knack for hearing the whispers of the world. Sadly, Torah died, never knowing the true nature of her power. Had she known, the old woman might have learned to focus, to train her inner ear to listen. Suri had spent the winter doing just that, and now, instead of merely hearing the voice of the wind, she could hear other people's thoughts. At Least it seemed that way. Orion insisted Suri merely picked up on strong emotions, the same way people sense changes in temperature. Her talent made her adept at interpreting people in the same way she was good at reading bones. At that moment, Suri could tell Orion was terrified. Suri didn't care. She was too busy flying, tilting her hands. She noticed how her cupped palms caught the wind, giving them lift. I really should have been born a bird. Can we fly? Suri shouted against the wind. No, the single syllable was drenched in tension. I meant with the art. I know what you meant. And no, you can't. The last few words were hastily added, as if Orion was certain Suri was on the verge of giving it a try. I thought you said anything was possible, I said. It feels like anything is possible. It's an illusion. You can't do anything unnatural. You can't become invisible or turn yourself into a frog. You can't create life, bring back the dead, or Suri turned her head, feeling like an owl spying a mouse. I brought you back. I wasn't dead, sure, pretty sure. And no flying, no flying. Suri sighed and jumped down off the rail, planting her feet back on solid ground. Arian's posture relaxed, and Suri could feel a wave of relief pour off the fray. Orion was looking much better, healthier than ever, and the wound on her head was nothing more than a white scar, which could be clearly seen since Orion had resumed shaving her scalp. The Merilith had resumed a great many things. Suri had done the unthinkable that night. Under the wool with Padera and Bryn, she had opened a door between their world and that of the spirits. Then she walked through. She'd passed through the gateway to the dark realms of Pyre, to the long river that spirits traveled to, reached their final homes in that sunless stream. She'd found Orion struggling against the current, but slowly slipping away. Everyone eventually succumbed to that flow, every living thing. But Suri still had a toe in the world of the living that acted as an anchor, a lifeline. She had reached out, grabbed hold of Orion, and pulled. In doing so, she'd done more than just restore her to the living world. Suri had fixed her. There had been a hole in the vessel that had been her body. From that side, Suri could see it plain as a tear in a blanket held up to the sun. She had sewn it shut, woven it closed, and dumped Orion inside. With Orion safe, Suri had passed out from exhaustion. Only later did she learn how close she'd come to death herself. Swimming in the river in that dark stream of the dead wasn't an activity for the living. Had she stayed too long, grown too tired, the current could have pulled her in and severed her lifeline. Then both of them would have been carried away into Pyre. Even after all that, Orion still didn't wake up for days. That week was the worst of Suri's life. She had lost Mina, and even after dragging Orion out of Pyre's mouth, the Fray had not opened her eyes. After she did, Suri fretted over her like a mother with a new baby. As Orion grew stronger, the Mirrorleaf discovered she wasn't merely alive, she was whole. Orion could use the art again. This is very disappointing, Suri continued. I can't become invisible. I can't be immortal. I can't create my own animals. I can't convince flesh eaters to prefer plants. I can't rearrange the stars or add a new season. And now I can't even fly. Orion pointed at her with the little ceramic cup she held in her hands. The friar had a fondness for an awful tasting tea she'd found in a shop in the city. Supposedly, it was the same stuff she used to drink back in Estramadden, but you were able to make beautiful flashing images with fireflies. Orion was always bringing that up. Really impressive, Orion said. Never saw anything like it before. I still don't know how you made such real-looking bears and bunnies out of streaking lights. Flies didn't much care for it. Suri left the balcony, returning inside the tower, getting out of the wind so they could talk. So what's wrong? Persephone still refusing to send a message to the Fane. Orion looked up, innocent as a thief. What makes you think anything is wrong? Are you sensing something? Don't need to. You just climbed the spy rock way too many steps just to tell me I couldn't fly. Orion smiled. What, you're just maturing so quickly, thinking like a merleaf. Is that a good thing? She nodded while rubbing the cup. I think it is. So I'm right, no message bird. Orion nodded. The Kenny is still siding with Nephron. The Ensteria here at Allen Wrist are just as unconvinced about the existence of a human artist as Rapnager was, which lends credence to my suspicion that the prince never told Lothian about you, given that Nephron wants to keep your talent hidden. He believes the Thane's ignorance gives us a tactical advantage. Surprise, he says, is more valuable than revealing your existence. Right now, Lothian believes he is the only artist capable of causing harm, because I won't break Pharaoh's law. Nephron sees you as our secret weapon, And what do you believe? Orion looked into her cup. Sadness, embarrassment. Suri read these. As old as I am, I'm still a fool, I suspect. I may have been too optimistic about the effect of rune artists softening Lothian's attitude toward your people. And now that we've taken Alan risk, I fear things have gone too far. The Fane can't just forgive and forget anymore. But you still want the bird scent. Orion nodded. War is inevitable. But one day, when both sides have drunk their fill of blood, the truth about you could provide the honorable excuse to end it. It's just so horrible to think so many people need to die to reveal wisdom that ought to be common sense. So turning me into a butterfly didn't save the world after all. Orion looked troubled. I can't explain, maybe you could. But I can't. Your ability to interpret is better. All I know is that the art tells me you are the key to saving both your people and mine. I thought it was by proving a link between runes and Frey and extending Farrell's law to the runes that just seemed so sensible. But people aren't sensible still. I feel it, this little string that stretches between you and peace. When I look at you, I sense hope. You're like this light in the darkness, and you get brighter every day. Orion rubbed the ceramic cup thoughtfully in her hands. Suri narrowed her eyes at Orion. That's not it. Something else brought her up here. She couldn't read Orion's thoughts, but there was another clue. Why did you bring that cup? Why carry it all this way? The tea must be cold by now. Orion nodded and held the drink up. Yes, this is actually why I came. Tea. Orion shook her head and put the cup down. Do you know the word sensler? Sorry, thought a moment. Mind, swift of mind to be precise. Orion said, that's what Fenelay called me. You're swift of mind to the most naturally talented artist I've ever known. And I've lived a long time. Thing is, I was given the title when I was 15. I didn't realize until after she died that I was the only one she'd bestowed it on. I suppose she thought I was special somehow. And now I wonder if she knew that I would be the one to find you. She wanted me to be a teacher, and I am your teacher, I assumed. She wanted me to teach the prince, and maybe she did. But now I think that she sensed the importance of my life the way I sense the same about you, in vague pieces, some clear and some impossible to fathom, because they haven't yet happened. Orion moved to the balcony's edge, put her hands on the railing, and looked out toward the east. With the evening sun behind them, it appeared to Suri as if they could see the whole world. The Burn River was a hairline at their feet, Mount Mayer a bump on the landscape. Then came an ocean of trees, what Orion referred to as the hardwood beyond that stretched another river called the Nidwalden. Suri took Arian's word for this, as she couldn't actually see it through the many trees across that river. What to Suri was a mere blue haze was what Orion called home. Only a week away, Orion said so softly that Suri almost didn't hear. A week and forever. She turned back to the mystic. Nephron and Persephone want us to recruit more artists, find more swift of minds, more sense laws. They think the Thane will be sending an army of Mirrorleaf, the spider corps. They are trained to weave attacks and defenses together, you know, like spiders. Get it? Suri rolled her eyes. A minute ago, I was swift of mind. What happened? Sorry, so Persephone wants her own spider corps, something like that. Good sense would advocate more than two artists. And how do we find them? Look for people really good at starting fires. Unfortunately, no, most don't manifest as readily as you, but dormant artists can usually be identified by creativity. Merilith often start as regular artists, painters, sculptors, or even talented craftsmen. The better the art, the more likely it is the person is a latent artist. Orion held up the delicate cup. Do you know who makes these? By the time they found the little house at the back of the Rune district, it was dark. For years, Suri had lived under the stars and never had any trouble seeing. Then she moved to Dowran and felt blinded by its torches and braziers. The same was true for this Frey city. Lamps on poles took the place of torches, and the effect was the same. They chased shadows from one place, making them gather all the more darkly elsewhere. That was the problem with people. To Suri realized as she and Orion made their way down the narrow alleyway. Unlike all other living things, people were never content to just live in a place, to be part of it. They always wanted to change things, to make places conform. Maybe that was why the gods and spirits appeared so cruel. Their way of saying quit. At the house was a simple wooden shack placed like an afterthought at the end of the narrow alley. A large storage shed, or maybe a small servant's quarters. It bore little resemblance to the other grand homes along the street. As they approached, Suri noticed a man and woman sitting out on the stoop. The woman was the one called Tressa. No one liked her, but Suri didn't know why no one liked spiders either, and Sari had long since given up trying to understand the insanity of Walden people. Beside Tressa sat Gifford the Potter. A jug rested in between. The two had been talking, but stopped at their approach. Tressa put one hand on the jug and pulled it closer to her. "What do the likes of you to want down here?" "That's him." Sri pointed at Gifford, whose brows jumped. "What did he do?" Tressa asked. "There's no need to pick on him. Gifford's a walking curse to himself. As it is, we aren't here to pick on him," Orion said. "Just want to talk a while." Tressa peered at them suspiciously. "About what?" Orion held up the cup. "About this," she addressed Gifford. "You made it." He nodded. "What of it?" Tressa spoke with the verbal equivalent of an antagonistic shove. "You against a cripple making a living." Orion looked at Tracer. "Could we speak to Gifford alone, please? Will that make it easier to cast some hex on him?" Tessa asked. "I have a better idea. How about the two of you just leave, go back to your fancy stone fortress, your one-eyed newts, cauldrons, and batwings, and leave us in peace? Will you do that, please?" "I've never known any newts. With only one eye," Sori said, "and I know quite a few." Sure. I bet you're on a first-name basis with them, aren't you?" Sori nodded. "Of course, newts are ridiculously friendly." This left Tressa looking confused. She glanced at Gifford, as if at a loss. "Gifford," Orion said, holding the cup up, "I think your workmanship is wonderful, stunning. Really, I've never seen the like. The porcelain is so thin, so delicate, you can almost see through it. Has a lot to do with the type of clay I use. Soft, usually white. The wheel I spin it on, and the heat. You need lots of heat. Well, it's lovely what you do, and not just the skill, but the creativity. The way the cup is shaped, this flower-like tapering, and the gentle swirl of the handle." "Thank you." Came all the way down here to compliment him on his pottery, Tressa asked skeptically. "Partially," Orion replied. "I also have a few questions." "Gifford, do you sing?" "How?" Tressa slapped her thigh like a bullfrog with a cold. Gifford frowned. "I can't speak well. Singing is even more difficult. My mouth doesn't act like it should. The sounds get mushed sometimes." "Okay, maybe not singing. How about humming? Do you ever hum while working?" Gifford thought, then nodded. "I suppose." Orion looked at Suri with a smile. "So the man hums." "So what?" Tressa grumbled. "Is it a crime to hum?" "I've been known to hum on occasion myself." "What of it?" Orion ignored her. "Have you ever felt certain it was going to rain when there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and then it did, or knew winter would arrive early or late?" Gifford shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe." "Have you ever started a fire by clapping your hands?" Sari asked. Both of them looked shocked. "No," Gifford said. "I think what Sari meant to ask was, have you ever wanted something to happen, and then it did? Have you noticed a lot of happy coincidences, like finding someone or something when you really needed to, or having rain? Hold off until after you are safely inside." "Don't think so." Tressa laughed as she indicated Gifford with both hands. "Can hardly be mistaken for the face of happy coincidence." As she clapped him on the shoulder, "Is what you get from a life of careful misjudgment and a bunch of drunk off their ass guards in a bad mood." Tressa spit wiped her chin and shook her head. "You think he's some sort of magician because he can make nice cups?" "It's possible." Arian said. "I want you to do me a favor, Gifford. I want you to move your hands like this." Orion made a plucking motion with her fingers while sweeping her hands back and forth. "That's right. Now look at my palms and think hot. Imagine my hands on fire. Imagine them melting. Imagine my hands turning black as ash. Concentrate. Close your eyes if you need to." Gifford stared at Arian's hand, and Sori was worried the potter might succeed in setting Orion on fire. She assumed Orion knew what she was doing, but just the same, Sori was ready to smother even the hint of a flame. Ever since Neath, Suri no longer had any trouble tapping the art. Over the last 8 months, her work with Orion had been mostly about technique to Suri. It was like they were back in the lodge once more, playing the string game together and learning runic and fray. Orion would demonstrate a standard weave and Suri would take it and often improve the idea, making Orion smile and often laugh or shake her head and say, "Why has no one ever thought of that before?" Suri was certain she could protect Orion from anything Gifford might do. Still, she was nervous. The deaths of Tura and Mina and the appointment of Persephone as the king had left Suri not only devastated, but alone. People were all around, but her family was missing. Trapped in the cold dark of Alan Rist in winter, Suri had suffered depression so black she couldn't eat. Wraith and Orion had pulled her out, but the losses were still fresh, and this made her protective, perhaps beyond reason. Gifford stared long and hard at Arian's hands, his brows curled up in a fleshy cramp above the bridge of his nose. Ow, Arian jerked her hand back. Okay, stop. Did I cause you pain? Gifford asked, stunned. Arian rubbed her palm. Just a little. Suri stared at Arian's hand, confused. She hadn't sensed anything, and any use of the art would have been obvious. Tressa glared at the potter and inched away, pulling the jug with her. You actually felt pain? Gifford asked. I made your hand hot just by thinking about it. Arione still rubbed her hand. Not too bad, felt like I was holding a sun-baked rock. But I Gifford looked at Orion, and then Suri, and finally a bit guiltily at Tressa, who glared at him. People who are creative are usually that way, because they are more attuned to the power and forces of nature. They can hear the whispers of the world, and it helps guide them in the right direction. Oftentimes we hear it as our own thoughts telling us to go left, or just a sense that going right is a bad idea. Some might call it intuition or a gut feeling, but it is the world speaking in an ancient language that you can almost understand. Animals are fluent in this language. That's how birds know to fly south in autumn, squirrels know to store nuts, and bears know to sleep late. When snow falls, trees know it too. This is how they realize when to shed leaves and when to wake up from their deep sleep. Everyone can understand the whispers because they are spoken in our native language, the language of creation. It's how the world was made. It's how we were made. Rediscovering how to speak our native tongue, how to tap and use that power in meaningful ways is what we call the art. Not everyone is capable of making an intentional connection. Fewer still are able to manipulate the power to their will. But you think I can? Orion held up her hand and rubbed it again. Yes, she said, I believe you can. Suri didn't say anything as they walked back up the alley. She glanced at Orion a few times but didn't ask. Maybe it was none of her business. They were nearly out of the ruined district when Orion stopped. You want to know why I lied? Orion said. Suri wasn't the only one with the ability to read feelings. Suri didn't answer, but she waited. Because I think he can. She began walking again, heading toward the lantern that hung near the well. Most of the time people just lack confidence. Doubt kills any chance they might have. People believe magic is impossible, and so it is because they refuse to try, or if they do try, it's only half-hearted, because they know deep down they know they can't. Sometimes all a person of talent needs is a little encouragement, and someone, sometimes anyone, believing in them. Avalanches have been caused by the tossing of a pebble, and miracles have come from wishful thinking that just happened to spill out in words. They were alone in the square that was dominated by the common well. This was where Bryn, Pedera, and several others from Darren now lived. Spring had arrived, but nights were still cold, and Suri pulled her mascara tight. Gifford will think about what I said. He'll play with it in the back of his mind, wondering the seed of doubt, and the absolute certainty of the visible world will grow. And when no one is looking, he'll try to make something happen. He'll try to hear the whispers of the world. And because I said it worked once, he'll keep trying long after he would normally have given up. Sometimes sheer tenacity does the trick. Why is it so easy for me? Suri asked. People are different, and maybe you somehow suffered. Orion paused at the well and nodded. When people are happy, they can become deaf. I don't know why that is, but I've noticed it to be true. Misery helps us hear. We notice more when we're in pain. We see beauty more clearly, hear the sufferings of others more loudly. Since you pulled me back, every sunrise is so much brighter, every breeze a delight. I think people who survive tragedy aren't so much scarred as they are cleansed. The wax comes out of their ears, and the clouds leave their eyes. The barriers between them and the world are reduced. You think I suffered somehow? Maybe, but I've been able to make flame since I was young. Then whatever it was must have happened when you were a child, which makes sense. I think the younger the pain, the stronger the influence. That's why Gifford seems a likely candidate. Looking at him, you can see he must have suffered for a long time. Suri was left to ponder this as they continued on. She couldn't remember being unhappy as a child. All the misery in her life had started a year ago with Tora's death. Before that, her life had always been wonderful, her youth a marvelous experience, at least the parts she remembered. When I found you, you were wailing so loud, you made the trees quiver, Tora had said, and back in Dauren, Suri remembered Persephone saying some children, the unwanted ones, are sometimes left in the forest, given over to the mercy of the gods. Even Gifford hadn't been dumped in the forest, thrown away as garbage. and left to die. His father had loved him, and Gifford belonged to a village that raised him for her, a desperate infant, abandoned in nature's Palman, clawing at anything to live. How thick could the veil between worlds be? You made the trees quiver. They were heading out of the square, rounding the corner of the quaint little house that Sari thought might be Bryn and Roan's new home. When she felt abruptly cold, so cold she shivered, Orion asked. Feel that? Suri nodded. Cold and clammy chills, like someone dropped fish down the back of your shirt. Orion nodded. Thought it was my imagination. You need to recognize that your imagination is more accurate than other people's sight. Orion moved to the side of the house. She put her hand to the stone and ran her fingers along it. What is it? I don't know, Orion replied. A message, I suppose. Message, a warning, like a bear urinating on a tree. Suri smiled. Usually Arian's explanations were vague or built on examples. She didn't understand this. At least she knew something is marking their territory with the art, maybe, or just leaving its scent in its wake. This is strong, or I wouldn't notice. I'm not all that gifted in second sight. You probably are. Do you get any impressions? I just feel cold. Cold and threatened. Suri nodded. Very cold, like death, but damp and clammy. And in what? Hungry, starvation, and exhaustion, frustration. So can you see it? Do you know what it is? Suri shook her head. All she had were sensations, emotions that lingered like smells. What does it mean? Arian shrugged. Maybe someone did something unpleasant here. I don't think so, Suri replied, as she touched the wall of the house. What are you feeling? I don't think something bad was done. I think something bad will be done. And I don't think someone will do it. I think something will. Chapter 10, Lord of the Wrist. The keep was this huge stone building filled with rooms, stairs, and corridors. It was where the rulers of Alnrest had lived. On the ground floor was the Carol, a small chamber where the king listened to grievances and passed judgments. Persephone used to call it her torture chamber. Each day there was a different torturer, but always the same victim. The book of Bryn, being the king of Persia, he realized was as rewarding as a punch in the face. The perks were equally as stellar, consisting of no sleep, no privacy, and excessive ridicule. Nothing she did was enough, yet every act was going too far. She'd been accused of favoritism toward people she'd never met, of knowing too little or too much, and of being insane. There were those who actually believed she was mentally unstable, suggesting the stress was driving her mad. Women weren't built to bear such weight was a common sentiment expressed when she made an unfavorable judgment against someone. People Persephone realized had very short memories, even shorter tempers, and acted like children. This was on grand display with Erdo, chieftain of Clan Erling, who came before her that day in the Carol to plead his case for taking his entire clan home so they could help with spring planting. She sympathized with him. The man had a point, but sacrifices had to be made that day. It was Clan Erling. I'm sorry, she said, looking down. She tried as hard as she could to sound compassionate, but after giving the same disappointing news hundreds of times to hundreds of people, the sincerity was difficult to maintain. We can't afford to lose that many men at this time. My people will starve. If he slapped the bronze railing that divided the room between the lower and upper half, the metal bar rang in the small chamber with a dull note. Erling will receive shipments of grain from the south to help them survive. Until we don't want charity. It's not charity. Consider it payment for standing guard. It's putting the Gullah at the mercy of Ruellen. That's what it is. Putting a noose around our necks and calling it a leash. Erder had succeeded Erger as the leader of the Erling. After Moya killed the prior chieftain in the contest that made Persephone the king, she had expected more challenges from the northern clans, but trial by combat was seen as sacred by most, and none more than the Gullah, for whom combat was so much a part of their lives. The Gullah so far had been honorable in their acceptance of her rule and obeyed her judgments, even if they couldn't always control their people over the winter. There had been 8 cases of murder that had come before her. The majority had been committed by Gullah runes against people from Rulen, but the Rulen runes weren't innocent and had a fair number of killings on their hands. Even more deaths had been reported in the territories where interaction between the two sides had been required. Persephone had left those issues to the local elders and hoped they would prove to be wise. There were no reports of Frey killing or being killed. Erdo, new to his post, was the loudest of the Gularoon chieftains. This wasn't his first visit to the Carol. Most of the room leaders aired grievances in the monthly council meetings, which made them run notoriously long. Erdo Wasn't the sort to wait. The south is better equipped to grow food, Persephone explained. There's better soil and a longer season, and the fields are farther from the enemy who might otherwise be inclined to burn them. I promise you your people will be looked after, but right now we need you here. Makes no sense. Arthur said, all we do is sit easy for you, all warm and happy here in the city. Me and mine have to sit in the fields in the cold and leaky tents. No need for us to be here. Been to full seasons. The Frey are scared of us. All this waiting is stupid. Use us or send us home. Persephone looked at Nephron, who sat to her left. Nephron leaned forward. How many times did Alan risk launch attacks on the Gular in winter? The Guloon shook his head. Do I remember? Then let me help you recall. Never wars are fought in warm weather. If you look outside, you'll see the snow is off the ground. Your enemy is on the march. They will be here soon enough. And if I were you, I wouldn't be so eager for their arrival. Now we have others to listen to. He waved his hand in dismissal. Persephone cringed. Erdo glared at Nephron, his mouth a stiff, tight line. He spun and stomped out. You really shouldn't do that, Persephone whispered to Nephron. The Frey leader looked at her puzzled. It's not your place to dismiss. Oh, Nephron nodded. You're right. My apologies. He glanced across the hall as Erdo retreated out the door. It's just I don't like the way they speak to you. These Gullah especially. They show no respect. No, and Starry would dream of speaking to a superior in such a way. No. Moya asked only one word, but she managed to saturate it with a sea of sarcasm. Moya stood to Persephone's right. There was a chair, but Moya always stood leaning on her strong bow. She complained endlessly about the need for more than a mere bronze bar, and of her footsteps separating those coming to complain to Persephone. People with grievances were angry folk, but Persephone wasn't worried. Moya had proved she could knock and launch 3 arrows faster than a man could jump the bar. The tale of her stunning victory over Udgar and her increasing mastery with the bow had made her a legend. Most of the clans imagined her in mythic hero terms, which was the only way most could resolve the contradiction of someone so beautiful being so deadly. Even the Frey extended an unusual degree of perhaps not respect, but caution for something they too did not entirely understand. While the secret of the bow had been disseminated to those interested in learning, Moir, who practiced daily, remained the master, and just the sight of her standing at the ready was better than 20 armed guards. That's not what Tekken tells me. She smiled at Nephron. The doors to the carol opened and Petrarch and Virtumus were LED, and seeing them Moya grinned. And what do you think these two would say about the respect in Staria show their leaders? Nephron smirked as the two approached the bar. I didn't say leaders, I said superiors. The carol was excellently suited for grievance hearing. Located in the base of the pipe, the chamber was off limits to most of the inhabitants of Alan Rist, and as such it sustained an air of mystery and awe. The room was also small enough to be intimate, but divided to maintain a judicial separation. There were no windows, and only the 2 doors, one for the petitioner and one for the judges, making the proceedings appropriately private in some ways. The carol reminded Persephone of the lodge in Dauren, but this was far more formal and ominous. She especially bemoaned the lack of windows this time of year. The doors of the lodge would have been thrown open to let the spring light and air in. Instead, she was trapped in a dim cave of flickering flame, listening to complaints about her leadership and being forced to disappoint nearly everyone. We have spent, Petrarch began in the Frey language, then faltered. He looked averted to us, who whispered in his ear, we have spent more than 8 months incarcerated. I am a ranking member of the Frey, and as such I demand our immediate release. Throughout this demand, Petrarch never once looked at Persephone. His attention was focused on Nephron, and while it didn't please her, it didn't surprise Persephone when Nephron responded on her behalf. You're responsible for sending a troop of Grimoirian killers to murder me. Nephron said, you're lucky to be alive. Think, Firil, you were born free as civilizations. Worth can be measured by its treatment of prisoners' virtues, said to Persephone. Then he too directed his comments to Nephron. Returning us to the Fane would be the first step in changing minds. We don't need to change minds, Nephron said. You had your chance to listen to fair debate. Now it's our turn to repay the kindness. Nothing can be gained by keeping us here, Petragar said. If anything, we are a drain on your resources. Good point. Nephron turned to Persephone. I agree with Petragar. You should authorize their execution immediately. No sense wasting good porridge on the likes of them. Theta looked at Persephone in wide-eyed horror. She had never ordered the death of anyone before, and the idea made her nauseous she could do it. Breglin had, but it was never easy and rarely sensible. A clan needed all hands working together to survive. Execution was a last resort when all else failed. But there were times when it was necessary. This wasn't one of those times. Escort them across the Granford Bridge, she ordered, still speaking in Frey. Give them food and water in the necessary quantity for a journey to a Raven. Then let them go. Smiles brightens the faces of both prisoners as the guards haul them out. You're being foolish, Nefrin said quietly, switching back to runic. And also weakness is no way to run a territory. I'm not running a territory, I'm leading a war. All the more reason you need to be more decisive, less accommodating. You may feel comfortable kicking your feet up in your home, but I have not forgotten that I am living in the house of my enemy. They watch us, you don't notice, but the Frey in the city stare at us with loathing. Pedera cooks my food because the Frey's chefs refuse Ron and her. Smiths are struggling to produce weapons and armor working in Ellenriest smithy, but your metal workers refuse to help. They don't know how to make iron and refuse to learn from a room. It's as if those Frey who chose to stay did it in expectation of our failure. They're waiting for us to give up and go home so they can scrub the smell of us off their floors and return to their old lives. What does that have to do with to date only Chagan and Grindel have died at the hands of runes? And no, Frey has been killed while I've been the king. The Frey are watching. If I execute to high-ranking Frey, if they witness two of their own being murdered by humans, their tolerance may well fade. I already have one war on order. I don't need another conflict inside the walls of my fortress. You keep power with fear, not compassion. Fear of the Fane united the runes and made you the king. Fear of the king will keep your people and mine united when they no longer fear the Fane. I don't want my people to fear me. They shouldn't have to fear anyone. That's the whole point. A fine ideal which you should repeat in public every chance you get. Persephone frowned. She didn't want to be sucked into the same old argument, mostly because she was starting to think Nefrin might be right. Initially, the gleaming Frey Lord had terrified her, but over the last year she'd come to depend on him for so much. Unlike the clan chieftains, Nefrin, in fact, all the Frey hadn't showed the slightest concern with her being both a military leader and a woman. She knew that, until recently, the Frey had been ruled by a female Fane named Fenelay, who led them to victory against the Durg. Nefrin in particular had been very supportive. Persephone found it odd how she felt more comfortable with and accepted by a member of another race than she had by her own husband, which made resisting Nefrin's counsel all the more difficult. How many more prisoners are there? You're changing the subject. Nefrin told her she can do that. She's the Kennick, Moya said while smiling innocently. Persephone was certain she had the only shield capable of wielding her eyes as a deadly weapon, and good shields are supposed to be silent. Nefrin replied a year ago such a comment would have terrified both of them. Instead, Persephone braced herself for the inevitable reply. Moya always had a reply, and Frey are supposed to be gods. Moya shrugged. Isn't life just full of disappointments? Moya's mouth, Persephone had mentally turned the phrase into a curse. The three of them had spent nearly every day of the winter together planning and organizing. At first, Persephone was certain Moya would get them both killed. She loved the girl to death, but Moya could make difficult situations impossible. Then, by the first snows, she realized Nefrin invited attacks. He appeared to enjoy her barbs. By midwinter, the two were regularly greeting each other with scathing insults to aid her. Moya had Techin teach her Frey profanity. How many more prisoners? Persephone asked again. Nefrin continued to look at Moya a moment longer, then shifted over. A little more than 100. Why so many? I thought Asteria never disobeyed their superiors. Moira jabbed again. Moira, thankfully this time, Nefrin ignored her. Petrogard and Vertimus are the only Frey down there. You have humans imprisoned? Persephone asked. No, he replied as if the question was ridiculous. Dwarfs. Why would we imprison dwarfs? I don't know. But what else could there be? We use the dojon as holding pens, mostly patrols, sometimes capture goblins, willows, or banquets. We even had an Arafachi once, and for a few years we had a white bear that we named Alpula, after a Grimorian legend of a snow giant. Persephone didn't know what most of those words meant, but imagined a menagerie of mystical creatures, a terrifying collection of nightmares under her feet. What do you do with them? Study. Mostly we learn weaknesses and strengths, attitudes. Motivations and languages, if applicable, are we done here? Moya asked at midday. She taught the bow to 100 would-be archers. Looks like it. Persephone was getting the nod from the door guard who closed the chamber on that side. Then I'm off to belittle and humiliate this month's crop of manhood. How are they doing? Nephron asked as he stood up, and they headed toward the judge's door. Very well, but don't tell them that this is part of the same group I had back in autumn, and I'm pleased to find they've kept up with their practice. Any standouts? Nephron held open the door for the two women. Moira nodded. A kid named Tesh is the best. He loves challenging me. Nephron was nodding. Sibik has the same problem with that boy. He's a natural, very athletic and driven. I've seen him practicing in weather so cold that Stone cries made himself a pair of gloves without fingertips on his right hand so he could better feel the string, and he's the only one besides me who could hold 5 arrows in the draw hand. The rest of my trainees hold them in their bow hand, which slows them down. Tesh isn't accurate enough, and he's not thrusting the shot with his bow hand, but he can loose 3 arrows faster than you can say your own name. He's been asking for armor. Nephron closed the door behind them. Wants to get used to the weight and balance. They keep telling him he's not done growing, but that hasn't stopped him from asking. He is Drayton, you know, Moya said as they entered the Pike's main hall, which was dominated by the huge doors and dangling chandeliers. Not a shaft of sunlight entered the crypt. Was the fortress within the fortress. The only windows were 7 stories up and very narrow. Explains why Wraith appointed him as his shield. Well, that's in great foresight on Wraith's part. That kid is going to be a killer one day. Persephone insisted on climbing to the top of the spy rock once a day. She wanted to see the world, and there was no better view than from there. She also loved leaving behind the shackles of her Kinnick duties. If only for an hour she could be just one of the birds that circled the tower. Recently Nephron had taken to joining her. At first she'd found it irritating. This had been her alone time. She climbed the 1,000 steps, which she counted on 5 separate occasions, to find solitude. He was an invader, yet as intruders went the Lord of Alan. Rick had proven to be charming somehow. That didn't quite fit, but was as close as she could come. How else could she describe how he matched her embarrassingly slow progress and pretended to need the occasional rest that to reach the top and looked east at all creation, cast in shimmering gold by a setting sun behind them. Wind blew, wind always blew. Up there, and Persephone gripped the icy stone ledge and leaned into the cold gusts, which felt good after the long climb. The world appeared so beautiful, hard to believe that out of that splendor death marched toward them. Do you think it will be soon? Persephone asked. Yes, Nephron replied. The Fane will have built his new army over the winter, same as us. I suspect they are already on the move. How long then? We have time. Armies, even experienced ones, are notoriously slow. Supply lines need to be established, which will be the first thing we'll target after the initial battle. Disrupt an enemy's supplies, and it's like poisoning a village. Well, everybody leaves. You've fought in many battles. He nodded with a smile that said he was being modest. He walked around the circle of the parapet with his arms outstretched. These mountains, forests, rivers, and caves were my playground. I grew up exploring every crag, cleft, and shadow, and those that came with me became legends. He looked out at the purple and gold of the most distant peaks and sighed. She thought she saw sadness in his eyes and realized he was likely remembering fallen comrades. Have you lost many Galantians over the years? He appeared surprised and shook his head. Just to McDack and Stryker were the first. She felt foolish for never having offered condolences, for Stryker wasn't a Galatian, he said with a little chuckle. Stryker was a goblin, one of the many guests of the Dursons. I pulled him out of his hole, thinking he might be useful. And Grigor, is he a Galantian? Nephron shrugged. Sort of. We picked him up a few centuries ago in Hentlin during a clan dispute, where he's that old. Grimorians age like trees, act like them to some, fall asleep for years. The bigger ones, especially Fergan Rock, the ruler of the dominant Rock clan, allegedly fell asleep for so long that dirt built up on him. Grass grew and sheep were grazing on his face. Legend holds that one little lamb tugged on an eyelash, and what was known as Mount Ferg, for reasons no one could by then remember, got up and turned out to be Ferguson Rock himself. Persephone smiled as she imagined a mountain getting up and dusting himself off. My father was the leader of the Ansteria tribe that made him Lord of Alan Rist, commander of the whole frontier. This granted me certain privileges, although not too many, as my father wasn't one for favoritism. But I was allowed to handpick my cohort. I chose only a few, but that was all I needed, because I picked the best. He placed his hands on the balcony ledge and looked out, and the adventures we had. He sighed again. But I'm no longer 500, and there comes a time when you have to grow up, I suppose. He turned to her, looked straight into her eyes and asked, have you had time to consider the proposal I mentioned when we arrived? I don't mean to push, and I admit that I have very little knowledge of Roman customs when it comes to marriage, so I apologize if I appear to be rushing things. Once again, Persephone was caught by surprise. More than half a year between comments wouldn't be considered a rush, could he said, and waited. Persephone felt flustered. To be honest, I haven't given the idea that much consideration. We've been together nearly every day, and you've never. I guess I thought you might not have been serious, or you might have changed your mind. Not at all. I merely wanted to give you the necessary time to evaluate the proposal. I was right. Charming really isn't the right word. Persephone had contemplated the proposal a great deal over the winter, so much so that she refused to meet privately with Wraith, even though he attempted to see her dozens of times during council meetings where all the chieftains were present. She made a point of avoiding him. Persephone couldn't afford to be alone with Wraith, not even for a second. Over several cold months of contemplation, she determined that Nephron was right. Their union wasn't merely advantageous, it was necessary. Persephone also realized that despite everything, she loved Wraith. Probably since the day I met him back then, it wasn't an option. Reglan's death was so fresh, and they faced so many troubles. I made excuses. He was too young. He didn't believe in me, didn't believe in fighting. His dreams were childish, selfish things. But even though he knew he couldn't win, he would have fought the Gullah champion for her. And he was still there, still in Alanric, training men. He hadn't seen her in months, but the man hadn't left. I'm running out of excuses. And she missed him more than she ever expected she would. Strange how infrequently I thought about Wraith when he was here, but how important the man has become in his absence. Thoughts of love had always been a luxury, before frivolous and indulgent. But now she had to think. She needed to decide, and that decision led her to a comparison. Nephron made his argument, which while sensible felt cold and empty in his absence. Wraith couldn't defend himself. He also couldn't ruin the growing appreciation that bloomed in a rich soil of selected memories that became all the rosier in light of Niflin's calculated arrangements, all of her mental debates, all of her reasons to choose. The fray sounded foolish against the powerful backdrop of longing that, instead of diminishing as she had hoped, had grown stronger. At first she had been ridiculously busy. Now she didn't dare allow herself to see Wraith, to be alone with him. The winter had made her weaker. This couldn't be a selfish decision. That was a girl's choice. She was a woman, a Koenig. Her own happiness couldn't get in the way of that. Persephone looked back at him with a concerned frown. Do you even like me? Nephron drew his head back in surprise. Is that important? I think so, yes. I'm not saying you have to be in love with me. I've seen Freeman and guess you find me somewhere between ugly and grotesque. But for a successful marriage, I certainly think a genuine, if only general, affection of some kind is necessary. He nodded thoughtfully. I believe I can honestly say I have enjoyed your company this past winter. Oh well, that's wonderful. I hope you didn't strain yourself with that admission. She turned away and crossed the parapet to the south side. Leaning on the wall once more, she stared out at the Burn and Urim River valleys. Without seeing either, these climbs were so much more enjoyable alone. You seem upset. Me? No, not at all. She refused to look at him. His blank, bewildered stare was too infuriating. Why am I so angry? Nephron was being forthright and honest, offering her a very sensible arrangement that would benefit nearly everyone. To her knowledge, there had never been a free human marriage. Such a thing would go a long way toward eliminating misconceptions and establishing respect between the races. That was the real battle, the real war that needed winning. So why does it hurt? Persephone remembered the first time they scaled the spy rock together. She recalled laughing with him when, after climbing those 1,000 steps, they couldn't open the door to the balcony because of the late winter snow. They'd just sat there slumped on the top step, cursing the God. She remembered how he'd lent her his coat, putting it on her so thoughtfully, and how he'd caught her when she slipped on the ice and held her hand as they crossed the rest of the bridge on their way to the General Assembly for the midwinter address. His hand had felt warm It had felt good. It had felt like I thought maybe he do. You still need more time to decide, he asked. Yes, she replied. And then biting her lip, she sucked in an unsatisfying breath. Spring was supposed to be a time of new beginnings, a renewal of love, and the joy of rebirth. Instead, spring was just a time of waiting, and death was on its way. Chapter 11. Monsters in the Dark. He was handsome, brave, strong, and 16. Neither one of us knew what we were doing. We did not care. The Book of Bryn. Tesh wiped the sweat from his eyes. Sabek had beaten him again, but just barely. Tesh had also very nearly lost a hand. The better he got, the nastier Sabek became. You're still watching my blades. Too much. Teklor Sabek told him. The fray wasn't sweating, not even out of breath. The story is in my eyes. Your eyes lie. Sabek grinned. Notice that? Did you nearly lost my hand because of it? Sabek's mouth grinned while his eyes laughed. Yes, you did. Despite Tesh's success, the other trainees avoided Sabek, which was likely his intent. With no students, he spent his days drinking in the sun and shouting curses at the pitiful performance of the sword-fighting hopefuls. The insults started in runic, but as he got drunk, Sabek slipped into fray. By the end of the day, he routinely threw things. Sabek was also undeniably the best living warrior, having trained with all the Galantians. Tesh knew this to be true. Ares had no match with a spear. Tekken remained peerless. With a thin, long blade, they all had specialties, but everyone knew that if the whole of the world fought, Sabek would be the last one standing. He was more than a pair of short blades, more than lean muscle, more than finely honed technique. Sabek was a killer. He enjoyed the sight of blood. Even the other Galantians didn't challenge him. Tesh made a habit of it. He relentlessly dogged Sabek. At first, the fray laughed at the stupid kid with the death wish. When Tesh refused to let up, Sabek taught him a lesson. Tesh had bled, but he'd also learned. Sabek hadn't believed it when Tesh came back for more. After a few more short-lived instructions and humiliation, Sabek became intrigued at the suicidal toddler who learned from his mistakes. When Tesh deflected an attack with a bare palm, Sabek stopped calling him stupid. He even stopped calling him kid. Tesh's new name was Tekler's Swift Hand. He was pretty sure Sabek never knew his real name. Positive the fray didn't care. Tesh didn't care either. All he wanted was to learn what Sabek could teach. All Tesh wanted was to be the best. He's just trying to scare you, Teklor said. The Galantian reclined on the grass of the courtyard, his hands behind his head, his chest bare to the sun. They were all there. All except Nephin. The Galantians found the matches between Sabek and Tesh as entertaining as the trainees did. Sabek liked the attention and usually put out the word that he'd be teaching Tekler again, which brought the rest running. He should be scared. Sabek returned his blades to their scabbards. Give him a break. Grigor said. He was sitting by the barracks wall, struggling to repair a tear in the sleeve of his shirt. The kid is out here every day, and most of the night. If we had 100 like him, Sokka said, we could invade Raven and be done with it. He's not that good. Sabek said. He's the best ruin I've ever seen. Sokka put in. Sabek gave Sokka a dismissive glance. I'm not interested in the best ruin. What good is that? Sykar got up and dusted grass off his legs. Just saying, he's practically an infant, and he's been training with us for less than a year, and already he's dangerous. Just imagine if he had been in Nadak or Durea when they were burned. Shakar paused and looked at Tesho. Wait, you're Duran, aren't you? Thought I heard someone saying that. Where were you when the attacks came? Out hunting or something? Tesh didn't answer. He'd spotted Bryn sitting in the grass across the courtyard. He pointed at her and smiled. Sorry, can't talk. More important matters to attend to. He followed this with a wicked grin and trotted away. Bryn was leaning up against the lamppost in front of the smithy with that same satchel in her lap. He grabbed his shirt and crossed the yard. Tesh expected Sabek to make a comment about the pitfalls of women, an insult at the very least. He didn't. The only sounds were the light-hearted taunts of the boys and men in his squad, none of which he bothered addressing. Tesh thought Bryn was the best-looking girl in a Landrest. An argument could be made that this wasn't such a big deal, since there were little more than 50 Roan females within a day's walk, and most of them were old or married. Still, some were worth looking at, like the archery instructor, but he didn't dare look at her. She scared him even more than Sabek. Besides Bryn, the only other girl his age was Nixie, who lived with her mother down by the goat pens. She was all right. He tried to speak to her once, But her mother was quick to shoo him away. "You shouldn't talk to that dragon boy," he heard her say. The mother's tone made Duran sound like a diseased. Bryn was better looking than Nixie, nicer, and she didn't have a mother. She didn't have a father either. This was something they shared, and Tesh imagined it connected them in some way, or was maybe a sign from the gods, a big eternal hand pointing at her and whispering this. One Tess had noticed Bryn when he had lived under the wall with Malcolm and Wraith. In Tyre there had been more girls there, pretty ones too, but Tyre ladies were a different breed, wearing sandals and dresses of dyed linen. Bryn wasn't a Duran girl, she was softer than that, but she wasn't a Tyre lady either. Long brown hair, face as cute as a morning chipmunk, with high cheeks and smiling eyes. Since the weather had warmed, he'd seen her in the training yard, always with that satchel. Everyone else noticed her too, even the old men watched for Bryn. And when she sat out on the grass, the trainees nudged each other and pointed first at her, and then at him. This warning gesture spread until all the other students moved away, fearful of being paired with Tesh. When Bryn was there, he had a tendency to show off. Tesh wasn't intimidated by many things, but pretending to look for Rome that day had been the most frightening thing he'd done since reaching Alan Rist. It hadn't gone as well as he had hoped. All that talk about Roe footprints and voices in the night didn't set the right tone. At first he thought she might have been messing with him, but when he found the clawed footprint around the corner, he had to take that seriously. Since then he'd made a habit of going for nightly walks down by her house. He'd circle it, then sit in the shadows by the well, waiting to see if anything was lurking around. Nothing ever was. And when he got too cold, he'd head back to the barracks. Tish wasn't sure what he was looking for, didn't know what a role looked like. But if anything tried to hurt Brian, he'd take his training out for a test run. Since their first meeting, he'd spoken to her after every practice. The last 4 times she'd allowed him to hold her hand. This time he hoped to kiss her. The thought had his heart racing. As usual, she was making black marks on incredibly thin sheets of skin with a featherless quill. Usually she stopped well before he reached her, but this time her brows were furrowed and her tongue stuck partway out of her mouth. According to Moya and some of the others, Tesh did the same thing when aiming a bow. Another connection. This had to be destiny. "Didn't it high again?" he said when she failed to look up. None of his training had included classes in eloquence. He had learned how to curse in 3 languages, but somehow he didn't think calling her a whore in Gaelic or French would impress Bryn. She looked up and rapidly sucked in her tongue, making a little slurping sound. She opened her mouth after that, but didn't say anything. She just stared. "She's finally fed up, tired of me bothering her, probably wants me to leave. You shouldn't talk to that Dorian boy." Every muscle in his body contracted, and he started to sweat. He needed to say something for the first time in a half-dozen visits. He asked, "What are you doing?" She continued to stare for a few more seconds, then looked down at her lap as if she'd forgotten. "Oh, I was writing, yeah. I'm the keeper of ways for the ruling clans, and you are," he blurted out, hating himself. He was shocked because he thought keepers were old like that Pedera hag the one in Doria had been. He just couldn't imagine a girl as young as Bryn being a keeper. Still, he should have known she wasn't just some girl. She was an orphan, but she was an Alan Rist. All the other women in the Rist were married to or daughters of serving soldiers. The rest stayed home in their villages to tend animals and babies. If she was at the Rist, she was special. Bryn nodded. "I thought you knew." Tesh shook his head. "I don't know much, but I guess being keeper, you know everything." "I think you're confusing keepers with gods. I only know the history of the clans. Still, that's not easy, right?" He was trying to compliment her, sort of like doing a backward parry with his offhand in the first match. He hoped this went better. "I had to memorize the ancient stories word for word from the last keeper, Mav." "How long did that take?" "Years. I started listening when I was real young. Made my first recital of the Song of Estuary when I was 5. That's when Mav really started training me. But there were still a few things I never completely learned. That's what this is all about." She laid a hand on the stack of markings. "I'm working at making a permanent account of those stories so anyone can know them." Tess knelt down on one knee and leaned in to look at all the wavy marks she'd made. "Is it magic?" Tesh knew that the Koenig had magicians working for her. He also knew all of them. "Where women know these marks just represent sounds, the same ones we speak when talking. If you know which marks make what sounds, you can read them." "Oh," he said, nodding confidently. but not understanding he didn't need to, he didn't care. All Tish wanted was for her not to shout at him, to go away. Every word he uttered was a gamble and an opportunity. So what is it you're writing? I used to call it the book Pine Markings of Bryn, but that's too long. Moya shortened it to the Book of Bryn, and I guess that's okay, makes less sense, but is a lot easier to say. It's going to be the story of the whole world from how it began to the present. Since you're from Ren, I suppose you'll say Mara created everything. Actually no, Erebus did. Tesh was an expert on gods in Doria. They worshipped the Minigan, the three gods of war, and he knew that Clan the Dock worshipped Bakrakar, the stag god of the hunt, and Ren worshipped Mara. Each of the clans had its own god, but he had never heard of Erebus. Erebus is the father of all the gods, and he had for children Theral, Mara, and Muriel. I knew Mara would get in there, Tesh said with a smile. He wasn't really interested in the gods, and was ready to move to another topic, like whether she'd consider taking a walk with him. Talking to her in the open, with everyone watching, was horribly awkward. Humiliation hurt less in private. The Durg liked to call themselves Belgrig Lugrians, but they were originally called Dromians. Tesh smiled and nodded. I was wondering if, do you see it, do you understand? Tesh hadn't been paying close attention and felt he'd been caught. He made a guilty grin that he hoped might be seen as charming. Knowing he was asking for too much, he added a shake of his head. Theral sounds like Frey and Drome sounds like Dromian. Even Durg and Dwarf, they are all variations of the same word, although Durg comes from the Frey for vile mole, and Dwarf is a runic word to indicate something small, and they shouldn't have anything to do with each other. But I think they might, that somehow all those words come from the same root. That would mean the Frey Belgrian and our own language share a common ancestry. I have no idea how that could be possible. And then there's Mara. She looked at him expectantly, inviting a response by making a handed-over motion with her fingers. Tash was at a loss. I never should have asked what she was doing. Now she thinks I'm Bryn smiled at him. I'm okay. It's like the first part of a joke. She doesn't expect me to know the answer. The masculine form of the word Mara is Mara. Do you see now? Thankfully she didn't even pause to give him time to answer. Mana sounds a lot like man, doesn't it? She was excited, really excited. He could see it in her eyes, bright and wide. This was important to her, and she wanted him to respond with equal enthusiasm. But all he wanted was a kiss. Okay, so maybe it isn't so obvious to everyone, she went on when he failed to say anything. Even Rome didn't make the connection. But think about it, those words aren't similar by accident. Firil is the god of the Frey, Drome is the god of the Dromians, and Mara is the god of man. It says so right in the tablets I found beneath. Those born of Firil, those born of Drome, and those born of Marta moved out into the world. You see, we are Marahern, the children of Mara, daughter of Erebus. Only she looked away, perplexed. Only what? None of it makes sense. I mean, okay, so this Erebus had for kids, but with who? Ellen. We call her the grandmother of all. So what does that mean? For that matter, who is Mara's husband? Or Feril's wife, or Drome's? I don't even know what Drome is. The Bilgrangian called the peak above neath Dome Mountain. Could that be a derivation? And what about Muriel? Did she have children? Maybe she made the plants and animals. I don't know, but someone had to, right? And where did Erebus come from in the first place? Did he have parents? Wouldn't he have to? And where did they come from? She sighed. I thought I had it all worked out, most of it written down. Father of the gods for kids that made humans, Frey and the Dug. But no, that's what you get from talking to Ron about anything. She keeps asking why until you want to punch her in the face. Tess just stared. You want to go for a walk? Bryn asked. He blinked. Oh, sure, great, she said. Bryn wrapped her pages up in the satchel and kept the ink bottle. Where are we going? He asked, for all of his desire to go someplace quiet. Tesh hadn't put any thought into where. I'd love to go for a walk in a forest, but there aren't any. Have you been in the Varentian? Not much. Bryn smiled. I'll give you a tour. Tesh grinned. I'd like that. He took her hand, and they set off. The Varentian was beautiful, and Bryn hoped he would be impressed. While not forbidden, the rotunda was reserved for official business, which left it empty much of the time. Brian had been there often, as she attended every meeting conducted beneath the dome. She also found it a good place to write when the weather was bad. Here, I want to show you something. She pulled him up a flight of stairs to the platform where Persephone and Nephon made their speeches. The sunlight shone through the skylights, but it was late in the day and the dais wasn't illuminated. She led him to its center and then whispered in his ear, say something. Her heart beat quickly, with the intimacy of being so close, her lips so near to him. Something he said, and his eyes went wide in amazement at the tremendous volume produced. "How did you do that?" he exclaimed, spoken louder. These words echoed. He turned, searching for the speaker who was mimicking him. Then the truth dawned, and he smiled. Bryn smiled too. She led him off the stage, and they circled around and went out to the tiered benches. "This is where all the important people sit when Nephron and Persephone are addressing them." She took Tesh's hand again and led him across the tile to a door in the back. "I discovered a world of hallways and doors beneath this place. I tried nearly every one. Most are open, but some are fast and shut behind a few. I've heard noises. Maybe they keep some livestock down here, goats or pigs. Haven't seen any, but it's kind of interesting. Come on, I'll show you." They dipped their heads under an arch, descended a set of stone steps, and entered a carved-out passageway. The upper portion of the corridor was made of blocked stone, the lower section hewn from natural rock. They were entering the body of the butte, and Tesh had to admit it was a little creepy, like going into a cave. Still, he didn't care. He was alone with her, and that was all he wanted. "Did you get your armor?" Bryn asked, as she grabbed a torch and led him down the steps. "No. You couldn't find Ronan?" "No, I found her. It's just they want me to wait. I'm not sure why." He knew exactly why. They said he would grow out of it in just a few months. He was the only one who could go toe-to-toe with Sabek. They'd sparred 12 times. But he was too young for armor. He wasn't going to tell her that you came down here by yourself. "Isn't this a little scary?" Bryn shrugged. "I've seen worse. I went with Persephone to Neath, and let me tell you, dwarfs know how to dig deep. This is nothing." "Oh, right. Chet said you fought a road, didn't you? I suppose this is a walk in a dewy field next to that." She waved the torch at a clot of cobwebs, burning them away. "It's a little scary, but not with you, not with Teklar, who's fought Sebek 12 times and only received one scratch. She has been watching." "Speaking of scary," he said, "have you had any more visits from the row?" "No, just that one night." She stopped at the bottom of a narrow corridor. Across from them, an open door revealed a small chamber with dry straw on a dirt floor. Bryn stared at it as if trying to make up her mind about something. Tash had an idea. What it was, at least he hoped he did. There were few places in the city where the people could be alone. Tess moved past her into the room. "It's all right, nothing to worry about in here. See." She stood in the hallway watching him, with big eyes biting her lower lip. Tash put his hand to the wall. "Stone is dry," he sniffed. "No mildew or mold. Not a bad little place, nicer than my home." Andrea actually. Bryn placed the torch in a sconce outside and entered, taking unusually short steps. As she moved toward him, Tesh found he had to take 2 breaths to gain the same amount of air. He placed his hands on her hips, drawing her closer. As he did, he noticed Bryn was having the same issue with the air, her chest rising and falling. Tess leaned in, pressing against her. She was trembling. He was to their lips, less than a finger's width apart. Drew in a common breath. His arms slipped around her. She answered by closing her eyes. Then, as his lips touched hers, Bryn arched up, meeting him. Tesh had never kissed a girl before. The moment he felt the press of her lips, he stopped thinking. Nearly every combat instructor had stressed the need to be in the moment, to not be pondering the future or past. Such a thing wasn't as easy as it seemed. So much of everything was held in the vessel of what came before, and the anticipation of what came next. Blocking out those thoughts was as hard as forgetting he existed. Tesh was certain he'd never achieved that singular state of perfection, never even knew what he was aiming for, until that kiss. In one flawless moment, Tesh forgot the rest of the world he might have stood pressed against. Bryn for hours or days, lost in the smell of her skin, the feel of her hair. His only thought, "I can't believe I'm really doing this." Legs weak, they slid down the wall to the dirt and straw. Some part of him wondered how he was still getting air. But it was a thought with no more substance than the cobwebs. Then everything changed. Bryn stopped kissing. Her whole body went rigid, and he felt her muscles tighten as she pushed him away. "What's wrong? What did I do? Does she think I was pulling her to the floor? Did she think I was going to?" "I didn't." He started to apologize, but stopped when he saw the terror on her face. It wasn't him she was upset with. She was horrified, but acted as if he wasn't there. She retreated to the door, pulled the torch free of the sconce, and brought it down toward the floor. "Look," she said. Their movement in the cell had brushed aside a patch of straw. The flickering glow revealed a familiar 3-toed footprint, one with claws. Chapter 12. The witness, Alan Rist, had been the 4th Fane, the first from the Astaria tribe. and the first male ruler of Iraven. He took power in the midst of the Durg War, after Fain-Gika of the Asenda had been killed in the initial battle for 5 dark years. He had fought a losing war against the Durg. After his death, Rest became the only Fain to be buried west of the Nidwalden River. The fortress that bore his name was also his tombstone. The Book of Bryn. As Sori walked, her feet gave rise to a cloud of dust. It was unlike the sickly yellow soil of Doria, easily disturbed and slow to settle there. The pallid grit collected on her, Ahsoka mudding its color, dulling everything here. The dirt was light, but the air was heavy. Spring breezes failed to lift the sense of suffocation. It couldn't. The stifling misery Suri felt wasn't caused by weather. Months of working with Orion had opened countless doors that Suri had previously ignored. Hand in hand, they had explored those new corridors, and with each discovery, Suri's understanding of the art increased. With understanding came awareness. The more she learned, the more she realized how little she knew. In the past, she had overlooked so many things that had screamed for her attention. She hadn't been blind to them, just never noticed. People always did that, so devoured by their own problems, they never noticed the wildflowers in their path. That spring she saw the world in a new way. She had learned to not merely look, but to see. Not everything she saw was pleasant. Overhead, the dark wings of 7 vultures circled against a gray sky that was too big to bear, too vacant. How can there be no trees? Suri asked, and let her arms clap her sides, issuing a burst of yellow dust. There's a tree wraith pointed at an ancient stump whose long dead roots resembled the skeletal remains of a hand clutching a fistful of rocks. That's not a tree used to be a tree. Suri turned her head side to side, viewing the entire tabletop plane. Is that what happened? People cut them all down. Wraith shook his head. Don't think there were many to start with. The 2 had left the Rist early that morning. No plans had been made, no rendezvous agreed to. Suri had awakened with itchy feet, the sort of irritation that could only be calmed by a good solid walk over new ground. She found Wraith at the ford, standing on the bridge and looking down into the chasm where the river rushed. She too had paused to take a peek. Nothing was said, no greeting, not even a wave. When Suri moved on, Wraith fell into step alongside her. That's how it usually happened. Wraith likely felt it was coincidence, but armed with her new sight, Suri recognized more was at work in terms of the art, the language of Ellen. She saw it as a golden thread that connected the 2 of them, just as she felt linked to Orion. This heightened connection indicated a relationship of importance, and the reason they so often found each other at just the right time. Suri imagined that she would have noticed a similar thread between her and Maeve had she known how to see it back then. What significance that thread indicated, Suri had no idea, but that was how the sight, as Orion sometimes referred to it, worked. In a way, they were puzzles. Clues, bits and pieces of half-heard conversations. Suri liked mysteries, but all too often when put together, these puzzles revealed unhappy pictures. How did you live here without? Suri shook her head. It's not just the lack of trees, there's so little life, no greenery, all rock. Now you know why we crossed the burn. Look, Wraith pointed back west and slightly south, where the land turned a lush green. The Frey call it Avalon Green Hills. Suri translated. Yep, he gestured longingly with his hands. At the site in my village, I woke up every day, and there it was right across the river. Look at it, paradise rising up into the clouds. We weren't allowed there. That was the land of gods. He sighed and frowned as his sight returned to the rocky world around them. This, we were told, was our place, our divinely prescribed lot, what we deserved. Wraith scraped his boot on the face of the stone escarpment he stood on. In a way, they were right. This land suited us, dry, hard, barren, prone to extremes of hot and cold. But he looked at her. I wonder how much of that came from living here. If we all lived where you did, would we have been different? Wouldn't matter, Suri said. Regardless where you're born, the world has a way of finding you and ruining everything. Wraith looked surprised. She shrugged. Okay, not everything, and maybe not utter ruined, but nothing stays the same. She resumed their hike along the edge of the canyon, looking for roots down during the cold of winter. All they could comfortably handle were short explorations of the city. Sometimes Tesh or Malcolm came along, but mostly it was just her and Wraith. They had tried crossing the ford months before, but the winds and snow of Doria were brutal. The city with its twisting narrow streets was sheltered but complicated. Exploring it provided just enough adventure to keep her sane. After months of darkness trapped in stone, the fortress became an uncomfortable cage. But when she and Rafe teamed up and slipped out, they were for a short time free. The advent of spring felt like the end of a prison sentence. They were out. The day was hot and Sori was intent on swimming. She just needed to find a way to descend the cliff. There's no way down, Rafe told her. She frowned. Wouldn't have been nice anyway, he continued. Maybe down by the crescent in high summer. It's a fine swim up here in spring. It's ridiculously cold. And I know that from experience. She hadn't told him what she planned until she mentioned the lack of trees. The two hadn't spoken all morning. Still, he knew only once before had Sari experienced that degree of harmony, that sense of comfortable companionship, that had no need for questions or answers. She couldn't help feeling a little guilty. Rivers age as they go downstream, Suri told Rafe, while they looked at the disagreeable gorge. That's what Turo once told me. They start out as tiny trickles, then in their youth and adolescence are like this boundless energy, throwing themselves heedless against unmovable rocks. Then they usually fall. Sometimes it's a series of tumbles and sometimes one great plummet. But hitting bottom usually takes the fight out of most rivers. After that they mellow and learn to meander around the rocks they encounter, taking life slower, easier. They spread out and grow quiet until at last they flow into the sea, becoming one with something greater. Wraith's eyes grew glassy, his lips squeezed shut, and a moment later he wiped away tears. For the first time she was baffled. Sorry, he said. It's just that you remind me of my sister. She would have been about your age, and she used to talk like that. He looked at his feet. I don't miss too many people, but I miss her. I remember laughing when she was around. She had a way of doing that even on the cold nights when there was no food. I can't remember the last time I laughed, and in all honesty, being with you sometimes makes me feel a little guilty, like I'm betraying her memory. He waved a defensive hand. I know that sounds stupid, but not so much, Sari replied. No, you remind me of someone too. Who? Suri smiled. My sister. Wraith looked at her. He was puzzled for a moment, then a smile came to his face, and he chuckled and nodded. Must be the for he reached up and ran a hand through his hair. So what do we do now? How about another game of stones? We could get rocks and juggle. You didn't do so well last time. You could use the practice. Oh, and I've got my string. We could just bask on the ground over there, and I could show you how to do a four-handed. Suri had been pointing at a flat place on the plain, one of the few areas where there was grass. While she was thinking about how soft it would be to sit on, a blast of despair hit her. Sorry, Wraith said. Rocks, she said. Rocks, piles of rocks. I don't see any. Wraith told her. Sadness here, terrible sadness, an incredible loss. That's Diria. Sori felt the sorrow welling up until she thought she might drown. That suffocating feeling rushed back, smothering her. Sorry, Rafe shouted as she collapsed to her knees and began sobbing. There's so much anguish here, she cried. Rafe lifted her up and began carrying her back toward the bridge. I think you've had enough fresh air for one day. No, Suri said. I don't want to go back. Yet she squirmed, and he let her down. Suri wiped her eyes and took a breath. You okay? Better. Suri took a few calculated breaths, then started walking back toward the bridge. She felt a powerful need to get farther away from that grassy place. What happened? She shook her head. Felt something awful. This is an art thing, isn't it? She nodded, but wasn't entirely sure. Suri really didn't know what had happened. It felt a bit like the sensation of cold she and Arian had experienced in the city. But the sensation had been far more powerful and personal. It had felt so strong that she was surprised you didn't feel it. She asked, feel what? Never mind, maybe it was just my imagination. You need to recognize that your imagination is more accurate than other people's sight. Suri didn't like that idea. Not in this case. She wanted it to be a mistake, felt it had to be, but not so much that she'd turn around and test the idea. Suri was happy to leave the question unanswered, because just as with the sensation with Orion in the city, Suri had the impression she wasn't sensing some awful event from the past. Whatever horrible thing Suri sensed had yet to happen, feeling a need to hide from the terrible. In a bath of ordinary mindlessness, she veered off course toward the wanton tree. Maybe we should just sit over here for a bit. Sure, he said. Then she saw him glance back across the plain, and he asked Suri, can you really? He hesitated. What? Can you really move mountains? She frowned. Yeah, But it was sort of an accident. I was upset at the time. Raph stopped abruptly. You're upset right now. He put his arms up, feigning fear. Should I be worried? Suri smiled and moved her hands as if she were going to hex him. Very you, he said, grinning, going to turn me into a frog. No, she walked toward the stump. Frogs are no fun. What would you like to be? I don't know, something that can fly, I guess. She nodded me to Nephrin entered the high hold, a large living space on the 7th floor of the crypt that most of the interior called the shrine. The suite of rooms decorated with tapestry, sculptures, mahogany chairs, and gold-rimmed chamber pots was originally built as the living quarters for the Lord of the Wrist. In reality, the 7th floor had only had one resident, and he'd used it for just a short time. Although nothing official had ever been declared, the quarters, although meticulously cleaned and maintained, had been left empty and unaltered since Fenris died. That had been a few thousand years ago. Before Nephrin was born, legend held that not a thing had changed. A golden cup famously rested precariously on the stone molding near the grand open hearth, and it was believed that Rist had placed his drink there just before rushing out to his death. His last act in that room, Nephrin had come in and looked at that cup many times, wondering what foolish little thing might be his last act that future generations of people would look back on with misplaced worship. He hoped it would be something grander than setting down a cup of wine. So what is it that has you so jittery? You want to speak in private? Nephrin asked. Sebek didn't answer. He closed the door behind them. Nephrin folded his arms. Oh, honestly, give it up. What's this all about? It's Teklo. Sabek spoke just above a whisper. The kid, what about him? Sabek proceeded to walk briskly around the shrine, opening the doors to the side rooms and looking inside. Nephrin waited until he was done. Sabek had always been a little volatile, a little odd, but the truly talented always were a little crazy. Nephrin had known Sabek for 1,000 years. He couldn't say they were friends, but then friends meant different things to different people. In all honesty, Nephrin had never had what he would call a friend, someone like him, someone he could relate to, someone who loved him and whom he could unequivocally trust. Sabek was more his opposite, cold and detached. The Frey loved only his swords and cared only that. He was the best at killing. Sabek liked killing. He cared nothing for power, for advancement, or wealth, just had a thing for fresh blood. Sabek wasn't an intellectual, not a thinker. Thoughts other than those associated with combat were a distraction, something to avoid. Sabek was as interesting as a dull rock, but he was a damn fine warrior. Well, Nephrin asked, taking a seat on the gold-framed red cushion couch. As Sabek walked back to him, I think Tekla knows what. There was a knock on the door and Sibik reached for his sword. Who is it? Nephrin called out. Sabek's nervousness had him concerned when the best warrior in the world was checking doors, whispering mysterious warnings and reaching for metal. At the slightest sound, only a fool would be relaxed. Your humble servant, came the reply. Nephrin looked at Sabek. Is Malcolm allowed in? Sabek answered by opening the door. Anyone see you come up? Maybe. But who would care? Malcolm walked in, still dressed in his absurd rune outfit of wool. Despite the change in weather, he also wore a confused look similar to the one on Nephrin's face. What's going on? Sabek checked the hall before closing the door. I was hoping you knew, Nephrin admitted. Sabek asked me up, Malcolm said. Sabek closed the door again. Tekler is from Doria. Malcolm glanced at Nephrin with a smirk. Yeah, we know. Is this news to you? He was there. Nephrin leaned forward. What do you mean by there? Sabek walked away from the door, making the wooden floorboards creak with his weight. Alan Rist had likely made the same sound. Probably he made that noise when he walked to the stone molding and set his wine cup down. The kid was in one of the little villages we burned. He lived there. Nephrin shook his head. Not possible. We checked. No one survived those raids. He pointed again at Sabek. You were charged with making certain there were no witnesses. Sabek stopped short of where the famous cup rested, gathering dust. He must have been hiding. He saw you, Malcolm said, glancing back and forth between them. That's he didn't see us, Nephrin said, willing it to be so. There were times he felt he was genuinely capable of such things during battles, or in general. Sheer determination and willpower were all that was needed. If he wanted anything bad enough, he could make it happen. This was often a warning sign of Miralith talent, as nothing could be more repugnant to him. He also wills that not to be so. What makes you think he did? Wraith and Tesh are the only surviving Dorians, Sabek said. Wraith lived because he was in the wilderness with Malcolm. But Tekla was a kid. Why would a kid be away from home by himself? That's all you've got. And when I asked him where he was, how he avoided death, he didn't answer. He ran off and wouldn't even look at me. Tash would have said something by now. Nefren said if he really was there, he would have seen us kill his family, his whole clan, if that were true. Do you really think he'd be training with you? He wants revenge, Malcolm said thoughtfully, as if thinking out loud. The skinny man sat down on one of the 3 fancy footstools. When we first met him, Tesh asked to be called Fra Hindir. Sabek's eyes widened. That explains the dedication. He's learning to kill us. He walked the length of the room, then turned around and stared at Nefren. I'm guessing he'll start with you. This is all. Nefren shook his head. Sabek wasn't as quick with his brain as with his swords. Has he told anyone? Has he actually said he saw us? No, Sabek said. Nefren shifted his sight to Malcolm. Don't look at me. I didn't even know about this until now. If he was going to tell anyone, it would be Wraith. They're both Duran, and Wraith is his chieftain. Did he tell him? Malcolm shrugged. It's not like we're always together. They've had plenty of opportunities to chat without me around. All the more reason to keep Wraith away from Persephone. If she were to hear of this. Ephron made a peek with his hands and rested his face in them. His fingertips pressed the bridge of his nose. Do you think she'd believe him? Malcolm asked. Things have come so far. You've built so much trust and credibility over the she's still a human, he snapped. They aren't rational. Malcolm raised both eyebrows and tilted his head slightly to one side. Excuse me, you know what I mean. Besides, you're practically frame. Malcolm smirked. I'll choose to interpret that as a compliment, even if he hasn't told anyone else. Tekla is still a threat, Sabek insisted as he continued to pace. That was another problem with Sabek. He always needed to be moving, fighting, killing. The phrase nightmare must be dying and being brought back to life by the gods as a still pond. He's only 16 years old. 16. What will he be like in another 10 years? This kid is that good. Sabek raised his brows. How good were you at 16 years? Not 16, not 50. 16. Nefron hadn't touched a weapon of any kind at such a young age. Like most in Staria, his first century was considered childhood. His first decade was looked on as infancy, a time for unencumbered frivolity and discovery. It's not the same with them as with us doesn't change the fact that in 1 year, the kid managed to master what takes most in Staria. 100. I didn't call him Tech Noir to boost his confidence right now. He has enough skill to best most Erevan Frey. And he's just 16. Nefren dismissed the idea in a practice bout perhaps, but there's a big difference between training and the real thing. The kid will hesitate. He has no experience. He's Terran. Malcolm reminded them. Traditionally, they aren't a squeamish people. Even so, it's not the same. Nefren stared at Sabek. Sabek shook his head. He's still a danger if he's this good now and remains dedicated to improving. What will he be like after fighting in a war? What will he be like in 10, 20, 50 years? Hey, after he's gotten used to taking the lives of Frey. Old Nefren, that more than likely dead. Don't forget he's still a ruin. He learns fast. He soaked up everything we can teach him. And the bow. Sabek rolled his eyes and threw his hands up. Moya tried to train us. Ares should be a natural. But compared to Tesh, they're bumbling fools. That kid can do anything. Now he's asking for armor, iron armor. A lot of them are. Sebek shook his head. Don't you see that's the last thing? When he gets that, Tetlaw will be ready. You nearly died fighting Wraith. Do you? I did not. Nefren scowled. You should know better. Sabek smiled. I do. I fought him just to be sure. But it's still nice to hear you say it. Nefren glanced at Malcolm, who looked up at him from his perch on that stool with an almost whimsical expression. Everyone had to believe a room could beat a Frey in fair combat, even the Galantians. Well, guess what? Sabek stared at him. You don't need to pretend anymore. In 5 or 10 years, there's a good chance Tekla could beat you in a fair fight. But something tells me Tekla isn't partial to fair fighting. Sabek walked toward the cup and gestured at it. You want to go back to your room one night and find a full-suited room with 2 iron swords swinging at you from out of the shadows while you're squatting on your chamber pot. Maybe that's what there leaves standing untouched in the middle of your shrine for people to visit. Nefren looked at the cup on the ledge and nodded. He had too many plans to let it all fall apart because of some revenge-driven brat. Disappointing if what Sabek said was true. Tesh might have been the first ruin. Galantian sounded like he'd fit right in. Maybe that was the secret of the ruins. They didn't last long, but while they lived, they burned brighter. Kill him. Nefren sighed and looked up at Sabek. make it look like an accident, nothing embarrassing either. The kid deserves that much. I can't exactly hate him for wanting revenge against the people who killed his kin now can. Sabek drew his sword and looked down at it as if the blade spoke to him. I'll do it in a practice fight. I'll kill him and say Tekla caused me to slip, that he was that good. Nephron nodded. A fine epitaph. He'll be a legend. Hey, after that the ruin that tripped up Sabek, he deserves it. One day he might actually have done it. Chapter 13. Avon Parata. What Dromedar is to the Durg, Avon Parata is to the fray. To the rest of us, it was a terrible boulder in our path. The book of Bryn Fenelay once referred to the Tower of Avampatra as the milkwell of magic. Only Fanelias could get away with calling the art magic. But then Fanelias got away with a lot of things. She grew her hair long, forgave the dog after a horrific war, and made a habit of crying late at night in the garden until she was escorted back to the palace. No one saw her drink anything stronger than apple juice. But Mondalet heard there were rumors. He'd barely known his grandmother. Wandala saw the old Fane only during official gatherings. By the time he was born, she was too old to do much more than drool. She lived to the ridiculous age of 3,127. Some people thought she'd never die. First in that line had to be his father, who had waited forever to be Fane Wonderel. Imagined his father had gone to bed at night and dreamed of smothering the old lady with a pillow. He hadn't. Instead, Lothian endured the passing of years in the shadows as the son of an icon that no one was eager to see die. Such a sentiment was understandable. The old Fane was the first ever Merilith and the savior of the Fray. Mondalet had never been a fan. He never liked anything old, and she was beyond ancient. The fact that Orion the traitor idolized Fenelay only made him dislike the old Fane more. Nevertheless, he remembered having second thoughts the first time he saw Avampartha. The tower was widely considered the grand pinnacle of Meryl's achievement. Not a hammer or chisel had been used. Wielding the art Fenelay had managed what no builder could have. At the edge of the Partolian Falls and in the middle of the Nidwalden River, she had raised a tower. Stone had been stretched upward, imitating an explosion of water frozen at its apex, high above the thunderous cataract. The stone splintered, bursting in a bouquet of slender points that tapered to the size of a finger. This was a sculpture done in the scale of creation. Nothing Montague had ever seen compared to it. The tower was beyond beautiful. It was evidence of what the art could achieve with enough power, skill, and talent. Avampartha was as close to divine as the Fray had ever come. A temple to the art Fenelias had made it. It took her 3 days. The first time Wandala laid eyes on Evan Parata, all he could think about was that old wizened Fane who drooled on herself. How had she made this? Seeing it for a second time, Wandala thought the same thing. Entering the tower was always a thrill. Fenelias had made Avon Parata to be an amplifier that conducted the insane power of the falls upward. Walking in Wonderla experienced the rush. It literally staggered him. This drew odd looks from the non-Merilith soldiers who trooped alongside. How can they not feel it? The year before, Grindel had spent the night in the tower, speaking to him of how Merilith weren't Fray, but new gods vibrating with raw power. He found the idea impossible to argue. Wonderlay was convinced he could remake the whole world from inside those soaring walls. That visit in the company of Grindel had been wonderful, full of excitement and expectation. This time was different. You're not taking the child with you, are you? Jared asked, staring at Montaigne as if he were a stain on the floor. He asked to come, and I thought the experience might do him good. Lothian replied he might be Fane one day. He should know something. As always, his father was overwhelming in the defense of his son. It'll be better if you left him here with me. Let me teach the child something useful. Wonderlake cringed at the very thought of being left with the old Kel. The steward of the tower was a month away from his own bout of uncontrolled drooling. He didn't even shave his head anymore and had a wreath of white stubble growing around a natural bare spot. Montadut vowed that he'd kill himself before getting so old. There was a limit to what life should endure. He's been attending the Academy for the Art back in Estramaden. Clothian said he's only done 2 seasons. I doubt he's acquired enough of the basics to even understand your lessons. The Academy, Jared said the word as if it were a bad joke. They'll ruin him. All those instructors with their rules and lesson plans, they keep tight control, afraid of mistakes. You and I didn't learn that way. Your mother pushed us to make mistakes. Only way to learn. Remember? Lothian nodded. Perhaps on the way back the comment made the hairs on Wandala's arms rise. Then I hope I die in battle. Mondale could avoid being enslaved to Jared and the horrors of growing old in one act. He imagined the moment as heroic and thought the place of his death would be enshrined with the same reverence as the two boulders on the river bank where Fenelea stood to create Adamanta. Kel, Jared, Fane, Lothian, Wandale, Vasek, and Terranet were all seated in the Kel's personal study on the second level. Sile and Sign did not sit. Probably wasn't a chair big enough for Sile, and Sign couldn't sit still. Those seated shared a bottle of wine, but Montaigne wasn't offered a glass. His father didn't appear to notice. Insulted at his exclusion, Montaigne displayed his indignation by getting up and walking to the window, although he didn't expect anyone would see his action as a protest. He knew, and that was all that mattered. Outside, the moon shimmered on the river below the Frey army as they marched across the Midwolden on a bridge that ran from bank to bank. The span was temporary, ordered by the Thane and created by Avampather Miralith. Once the army was across, the bridge would dissolve. I don't expect this war to take long, his father said. We have nearly 2,000 soldiers and almost 50 Merilith. When we get there, erasing this insurrection and reclaiming Alan Rest shouldn't take more than an afternoon. I won't bother to stay for the longer process of eradicating the ruins. It could take months to get them all. I leave it to the new Lord of the Wrist. He nodded toward Tarini. Addressing Jared once more, he said, I should be back in a few days. You can have Mondale. Then wonderful. It'll be good for the lad to get out of that viper's nest you call Estermandanon, Jared said. Then his voice grew a tad louder as he added, I heard you got yourself in with a bad crowd. The bad crowd. In his mind, Wandala saw the fleeting image of Macareta's face under a bridge lit by magical light, the way he always remembered her. She was probably dead. He'd never found out, and the lack of knowing was difficult to take. The memory of her always hurt, and he wished it didn't. Macareta had used him, tried to kill his father, did kill dozens of good people, and yet in his mind he still saw that beautiful face and remembered how being with her felt. Her memory was frozen in flawless perfection, the highlight of his life, the only time his life had made sense. Realizing his future would likely be a sad legacy, he saw those days with her as a shining moment made brighter by the dark tragedy of its loss. He hadn't even had the chance to kiss her. Despite everything, he still fantasized what that might have been like. No one said anything for several seconds, and Montaigne realized Jared had been speaking to him when he made the comment. They were awaiting his reply. He turned back from the window to see everyone watching. He focused on Cal. Jared, the old Frey, looked far too satisfied. Bad crowd. Perhaps all I knew was that I was invited to a casual gathering by people considerate enough not to drink in front of me. The Fane stiffened. Wonderlay show respect for the Curl, of course, father. I shouldn't wish to insult such an accomplished fry. He continued to stare at Jared. I heard you got yourself in with a bad crowd of giants. Oh, and congratulations on killing Orion. You did a superb job there, Mon Sherry, his father erupted. Jared held up his hand to settle him. It's fine, the child is wild. I'll fix that. Mondale, you might be a prince in the Talwara, but here you're an infant. If you want grape juice, make your own. You're a mere leaf, aren't you? The art doesn't create. Montaigne said no. Jared held out his hands, indicating the walls around them. What's all this then? Fenelius drew up stone. She didn't make it really touch the wall there. What kind of stone is that? Do you think granite? Limestone? I'm not an Elwyn. I don't know rocks. What you don't know is vast, Jared said. He snapped his fingers and a goblet appeared on the windowsill. Rather than wine, it was filled with a stack of strawberries there. He said, try one of those. They're perfect with the real thing. You can never find them at their peak, or if you do, they're always too big or too small to tart or sweet. No, I must admit I pride myself on creating a good strawberry. Wanderley stared at the cup of fruit, stunned. Even Grindel never created. He was scared to touch any of the berries, but curious about how they would taste. Were they real? He reached out, plucked one off the top, and bit into it. Perfect across the room. The Kel of Avampartha smiled. Still think I can't teach you anything? I never said you didn't have to. Even without the art, you're an easy riddle to solve. You're the heir apparent to the forest throne, but you don't get the job unless you can win the challenge. If we held it right now, if your father dropped dead this very minute and Amali gave me the horn of Glendora to blow, who do you think would win? A child who whines about not being given a cup of wine, or an old Frey who can snap perfect strawberries into existence. If you want wine, if you want anything, Mandel, you make it yourself or go without, don't rely on anyone but yourself. Wonderlay was up early, standing on the south balcony. This was something Grindel had shown him when they were last there. The First Minister had roused Montalio from a deep sleep. The prince wasn't used to getting up before midday, and getting up before dawn was unconscientable. But Grindel had whispered for him to follow. The whisper had caught his attention. Whispers were for secrets. Maybe Grindel was going to share something personal, Wandel thought, and indeed he had. That morning, just a year ago, Mondale had slipped out with Grindel to observe the sunrise over the Partholian Falls. The light sent shafts across the brink, and through the spray vivid brilliant rainbows formed standing on the damp edge of the balcony. He stared in awe at a world that appeared more magical than he knew it was. The view this morning wasn't as grand as before. Wonderla had wanted to recapture that moment when he and Grindel had stood side by side on that balcony and watched the glory of the world awaken, one of his best untainted memories. But what at once thrilled him now left him feeling dull, empty, and lonely. Grindel was dead. Even a Venpather felt smaller. Beautiful, isn't it? Mondale spun to see Jared in the archway. The ancient Frey wore a heavy cloak that he clutched to his wrinkled neck with bony hands. What's he doing here? What's anyone doing here? Fenelay rightly assumed that people would want to look out into the falls, and as a result she'd created hundreds of balconies. Wandela, like Grindel before him, had selected a remote one. Yet here was Jared. The cow smiled and shook his head. Poor situational awareness. What's that supposed to mean? Montalio pushed back against the short rail. He felt trapped before him. The nasty old man was grinning with malevolence behind him. The roar of the falls proved more frightening when he couldn't see it. Jared, feeble as he was, appeared dangerous. As he blocked the way back inside, he felt my fane. Sometimes people do that. And as we both know, your son wasn't the brightest star in the heavens. Yes, Monday has always been a disappointment. Let's not waste any more time on him. How about another cup of that marvelous wine? And maybe a strawberry. Your mastery of the art has been stunted, Jared said. If you were one of my students, and you will be, you'd have known I was coming before I arrived. So you can tell the future too. He's blocking the exit on purpose. I'd have to push him aside to get by. I'd have to touch him. Wandela had no desire to be in the same world as Jared. He certainly wasn't going to touch him. Wandela slid his hands along the little wall of the balcony. Maybe I can climb down. The stone was polished smooth, and even at that height still damp from the mist. He might as well have been leaning on ice. I can do many things Grindel could. Did you know he could see what was happening hundreds of miles away? It's called clairvoyance. Even Fenelay couldn't do that. Doesn't surprise me. Grindel was far better than. Don't even think of finishing that thought. Jared stepped out onto the balcony with a raised hand. Wandela remembered how Grindel had exploded the room with a snap of his fingers and froze. Grindel had some promise, some talent, but he was consumed by his own arrogance. I gave up on him years ago. Gave up. I taught him the art you taught. Grindel, my father said he went to the academy, said he learned from my brother. Jared smiled. You'll find many teachers over the course of your life, Wonderla. So did Grindel. He did indeed attend the art school, but just as with you, I offered to take over his instruction. Being smarter than you, he thanked me for the opportunity. And after I gave up on him, he found another mentor, who the same one who taught Fenelay. Mondale narrowed his eyes. No one taught Fenelay. She invented the art, my father said. So he's just boasting, trying to sound important. Jared shook his head. You're too much like Grindel. I can see the imprint he placed on you, but I can't see why he was using you for something but what. Grindel was my teacher. The Kel laughed. Grindel had no interest in teaching anyone anything. He had one goal: power. That's why he came to me for instruction. That's why he left me for what he believed to be a better teacher. Power was always his goal, and somehow you were part of that path. For him, I just can't see how. He sighed. Doesn't matter. The phrase is dead, consumed in the fires of his own arrogance. His plans gone with him. My task will be to fix you. Normally, I wouldn't bother. He waved at Mandalay with a dismissive gesture. Hardly any raw material to work with, but you are the prince, and that gives you a shot at the throne. Through no virtue other than your birth, you'll have a chance to be Fane. I owe it to fair all, and our people, to at least try and make a worthy Frey of you. I'm not broken, but you are, and in oh so many ways luckily you have hundreds of years to make up for lost time. Ain't you all going to teach me?" Jared smiled. "You think learning from me will be boring? A bunch of dull exercises like those they drill into you at school, eh? What do you say we start our first lesson right now?" Mondolet sensed a vague threat in that suggestion. "First lesson? I'll throw you over that railing, and you can learn to fly." "Sorry, my father says we're marching this morning. He's in a hurry to kill some people, and I get to watch." Jared nodded, that smile stretching wider on his old shriveled lips. "How would you like to do more than watch? Your father tells me you hated your old teacher. She stopped you from exacting justice after Grindel's death. You wanted to punish her for that, don't you? She's a traitor. She should die. That's the law." Yes, the law, of course. But how would you like to be the one to enforce it, to be the one to execute her?" Wandala stared at the withered old man. The wind wafting in updrafts flapped his pale cloak and blew several strands of white hair against the grain. What are you saying?" "You were right. Last night I failed to kill her as your father ordered. I won't make the same mistake twice, but I'm a little too old for extended travel." He gestured up at the tower rising behind them. "As you can feel, this is an extremely powerful source. From here I can launch an attack on Alan Rist if I wish. That didn't work on Orion before. No, it didn't. There are limitations. Avampathra allows me to see and hear and direct the art over vast distances, just not all at the same time. I was able to find her, then I had to disengage and swing blindly. Locating her was difficult after she knew what was happening. If I had someone on the ground, someone right there in the thick of it, who could send me updates and direct my attacks, combating Orion would be a simple matter. I just need someone I can work through, someone like you." "How could I do that?" "That's where the lesson comes in, that awful teaching part. I don't have time to learn. Just as Grindel knew how to see long distances, I know how to speak across leagues. I can show you right now how to hear me, and then continue your education as you travel on toward Alan Rist. By the time you arrive, you'll be able to help me target Orion through you. I'll be able to erase my mistake, and you'll have your revenge then. When you return, I'll show you other things. The next Fane ought to know things that will make you invincible in the Carfane arena." Montreal found himself nodding. "Beautiful sunrise, isn't it?" Jared said. Despite himself, Montreal couldn't disagree. Chapter 14, House of Bones. Strange how life often delivers the worst with the best, the highs with the lows, happiness with sorrow, and joy with screams that haunt a person forever, making it impossible to sleep in a room with a window. Then again, that might just be me. The Book of Bryn. Despite the beautiful spring afternoon, Bryn continued to glance nervously over her shoulder as she crossed the corbel bridge that connected the Verentian to the kite. Memories of that damp hand clamping over her mouth continued to send chills through her. "Relax, don't struggle." Brian had to tell someone she would have gone to her mother. If that had been possible, hearing her say that everything would be fine while giving Brian a tight hug was what she needed. Her mother was always good at that. But her mother was dead. "I have you now." Bryn banged on the door to the keypad, and the little window in the door slid back. "I need to see Persephone." Bryn said. The door opened. They knew her. She was the keeper of ways and had the run of the place by order of the king. "She is up on the high floor," Ellison told her, jerking his thumb at the ceiling. The fray closed and bolted the bronze door behind her, sealing out the sun. Bryn should have felt safer behind that heavily secured door. "She didn't just need to get you back to the pile." Persephone was all smiles when Bryn poked her head into the meeting room. The kin sat at one of the 4 tables filled with chieftains and Frey, each wearing serious faces. This wasn't a council meeting. They were held in the Verentian, but Persephone looked just as frustrated. Before Bryn could say anything, the kinetic was up and walking toward her. "I don't want to interrupt. Persephone raised a hand, stopping her, looking back at those in the room. The Kneek said, "I'm sorry, you'll have to excuse me a moment." Lippet continue, "and I'll be back in a few minutes." With that, Persephone grabbed Bryn by the hand and hauled her into the corridor. She closed the door, threw her back against the wall, gritted her teeth, and began to bang her head against the stone. Surf. Bryn said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Again she held up a hand. "It's not you, trust me. I could kiss you for getting me out of there. I hate it when they bicker. The Gullah think I'm trying to enslave their clans through a dependence on Roland food. The Roland chieftains are terrified because I'm making them farm while the Gullah runes train our people. Are convinced the Gullah will turn on us, and every day there are more Reports of incidents, insults, and conflicts between Frey and runes. Bren smiled. I'm glad I missed it lately. All your meetings have been the same, not really worth writing about. Even the council meetings have been pretty repetitive. Persephone took a deep centering breath. Wraith was right for turning down the job. She pushed herself off the wall. Do you ever see him, Wraith? I mean, Bryn looked puzzled. Isn't he in there right now? No, this is primarily a discussion about clan grievances, and he doesn't have much of either. He doesn't even come to many of the council meetings anymore. But that's not what I meant. I was referring to a more informal setting, one not based on official matters. Do the two of you talk sometimes? Does he seem all right, I suppose? What's he been doing? I don't know. She shrugged. Mostly, I guess he's been teaching the young men in the courtyard. That's where I usually see him. He and Suri also go on a lot of walks. Neither one of them likes being in the city much. Why don't you ask him what he's been doing? I was just curious. Persephone smiled. Never mind. Did you want something, or just come to save me from going crazy? Bren hesitated, biting her lip. Persephone's eyes grew concerned. What is it? What's wrong? I think we have a row, Wraith asked, and Alan wrist. Tesh nodded. They stood between the great towers on the parapet above the main gate that afforded an unrivaled view of the Granford Bridge, and beyond it the plateau of Doria. Tash knew he'd find Wraith there. The parapet was one of the few places to look at their home without having to climb a few hundred steps to see over the walls. And he knew Wraith liked watching the sunset from there. Perhaps looking out at his old home had a way of reminding his chieftain of how far he'd come, which when measured in physical distances wasn't far at all. Wraith had his sword out, rubbing the blade with an oily rag. Brome had told everyone to do that once in a while, said otherwise the metal might go bad, like it was meat or something. Wraith was always oiling his. He took care of it like a woman with a newborn. Unlike the rest of them, Wraith's blade wasn't made by Rain or one of our army of workers. The sword he cleaned was dwarven. The one Persephone had brought back from Neath. Not only was it an excellent weapon, it possessed a remarkable legend. Many believed its markings were magical because the sword was reputed to have destroyed a mountain, made Persephone the king, and slain a dragon Rao who don't live in cities, and certainly not fortresses. Wraith explained. Bryn is convinced it's a Rao. Tess said she ought to know. She says she heard it one night, and I saw a clawed footprint near her house, then another one when we were down in that maze of corridors and rooms under the Varentian. Wait, what you and Bryn, what in Myra's name were you two doing down there? Tess shifted uneasily. He wasn't trying to avoid the question so much as trying to find the right way to answer. He didn't want to admit it hadn't been his idea, that Bryn had let him down there. Rafe scowled. Tash, the girl's only 14. She is not. She's 16. Her birthday was months ago. And what about you? I'm 16 too. Wraith rolled his eyes. I know how old you are. But where's your house? Where's your livestock, your crops, your furs, your fields, your traps? How are you going to take care of her? How are you going to take care of a child that happens from kissing? Rafe smiled. Never mind now. What's all this about a raw? Tash watched as his chieftain carefully slid the magic blade into a scabbard that was decidedly less impressive. We think someone's hiding it, taking care of it like a pet. I guess no one keeps a row. Why would they? Outside my window I heard two people talking. Bren said one was a man, the other a row. I'm sure of it now. I could tell by the voices. She looked at Persephone until she was certain she understood. This was another reason Bren had wanted to talk to her. Persephone didn't need her to explain. I've been thinking about it. I remember that the man said something about an agreement. They had agreement. Bryn nodded. I think the man was hiding it, feeding it somehow. He mentioned someone by the name of Jada. I think he might have lured Jada to the rally. Persephone was shaking her head. Why would anyone keep such a thing? How could they? Under the Varentian are all these little rooms. I saw a footprint in one of them, a row footprint. It's called the dungeon. Persephone said. A prison? I don't think there are any people down there anymore. But Nephrin mentioned they used it for studying creatures. You shouldn't be going down there. Well, trust me, I won't anymore. But what if there had been a row there, and someone let it out? Persephone rested the back of her head against the wall while her tongue slipped back and forth across the front of her teeth. Who would do such a thing? And why, I don't know. But I think it was a room. How would a run get access to a Rao from the Dorgan? It'd have to be a Frey. They are the only ones who know about that place and have access to it. Bren shook her head. I found the dungeon Maybe someone else did. To the night I heard voices under my window. They were speaking runic. Never speaks runic. A lot of Frey do, but not when they are by themselves. And it's possible Rao only speak runic. The one that grabbed me did. It's just that the one talking to the Rao didn't sound like a Frey. He sounded like a man. Lakasephani frowned with a skeptical look. You're still having the nightmares, aren't you? It's not that I know this sounds like Bryn. It hasn't been that long. I still wake up covered in sweat. And I wasn't taken by that thing. It's real. Okay, let's say you're right. How would a Run learn about a Rao trapped under the Verentian? And why would he be willing to hide it? Do you remember that house in the city the first day we arrived? Wraith asked, making the switchback turn near the rain barrel. As they headed down the stairs, the one Malcolm used to live in, the one where he got in the fight with that fussy fellow. Tesh replied. Rafe nodded and came around the third switchback. The two were practically dancing down the staircase. But because of their worn boots, the only sound came from the slap of scabbards. The two had left the parapet and begun walking back toward the open-air kitchen, which had been set up in the training yard. No discussion, no comment. They both just started walking. The moment they caught the smell of smoky roasting meat wafting from that outdoor spit, meal time had a way of pulling people that way. Yeah, Merrill said he was living there alone. But I saw someone in the upstairs window. I think I remember you saying something about that. But I didn't see anyone. Tesh's stomach rumbled. He was starving. He went for hours working the rings, running the obstacle course, or sparring. Then he'd smell food and start salivating. There was definitely a pair of eyes up there. Drew away the moment I spotted them. What are you thinking? That was the Row. Wraith shrugged. Why did Merrill say he lived alone? Maybe it was a woman, maybe a frail woman. I thought of that. But why would he hide such a thing? Why would he care what we thought? In fact, didn't Malcolm mention something about him lying? That's bothered me ever since. Why would he lie? By the time Bryn left Persephone, it was obvious the Kinnick didn't believe her. Otherwise, Persephone would have done something. Instead, she insisted that Bryn stay and eat, proving by her lack of urgency that Persephone thought she'd only had a bad dream. As frustrating as it was to be ignored, Bryn conceded that she needed to eat. She was in fact starving. During the meal, Persephone made a point of asking numerous questions on random, unimportant subjects, none of which had anything to do with Rao's dangers or sleepless nights. They talked about how Rain was killing herself at the forge trying to create the perfect metal. Her dwarfs had become Rome's devoted slaves. They also discussed a quilt Badera was making with squares that depicted scenes from the last year, including one showing their fight with Balgarath. The story squares had been Bryn's idea, but she thought it too arrogant to say so. And they also talked at length about the book of Bryn. Bryn had 30 pages written that covered the origin of the gods, how Firil, Drome, and Mara had created the Frey dwarves and men, and how the evil one called Uberlin was born. And this somehow made the children of Erebus turn against their father and attack him. That whole area was murky. Some of the words were ambiguous enough to be confusing, and at times reading the old one's markings wasn't easy. This history of the gods was the first officially completed portion of the Book of Bryn, aside from the metal formula that she did especially for Ronan, that she had set aside within an envelope of sheepskin and placed in a drawer for safekeeping. She explained to Persephone how she thought she would do the whole book that way, section by section, putting the completed parts away in separate places to avoid the disaster of her life's work all being destroyed by some awful accident. At some point after the whole work was completed, she would create copies and bind them all together into one great volume. By the end of the meal, she had nearly forgotten about the Row, which she guessed was the whole reason Persephone had asked her to stay. If it had been only a dream, the meal and carefree conversation would have made her feel better. But it hadn't. The Row was real, and the fact that the sun was casting long shadows by the time Bryn left the kite brought the worry back. I won't get home before dark. She had just reached the steps down to the city when she heard him. Hey Bryn. She spun to find Tesh leaping down the steps from the fortress, taking 3 and 4 at a time to reach her. She stopped and waited, clutching her satchel to her chest and gritting her teeth in a war with her lips in an effort to keep from smiling. He likes me, let me walk you home. Okay. He was puffing from the run, his chest rising and falling. He raked back the hair from his eyes and wiped the sweat from his brow. The evening sun splashed across Tesh's face highlighting the wisps of beard coming in unevenly on his chin cheeks. An upper lip by Mara, you're beautiful, afraid something might happen to me, kinda. Yeah, Brim had been joking, flirting. She didn't expect him to say yes. He wasn't there to charm her. Tesh had come to protect her. While his concern was thoughtful, it scared her. Really, what did Wraith say? He doesn't think we're crazy. More importantly, he reminded me about someone named Merrill who lives in the city on Yolanda Hill. He says he lives alone, but Wraith remembers seeing someone looking out through this guy's window. And you think he's hiding the row? Not sure technically. We only know he's lying. Well, that and he's hiding someone. Raphael's going to talk to Malcolm because he used to live with Merrill. What did Persephone say? I don't think she believed me. She thinks I just had a nightmare. But I did learn those little rooms are cells. It's called the dungeon, a prison. Theophane says the Galentians used the cells to study creatures. So maybe they had a row. I still don't understand how anyone can control a row. Oh, so you don't believe me now either? Bryn was getting more than frustrated with everyone. Not, I didn't say that I believe you. I'm just wondering how someone could do that. Oh, she said softly. I mean, my mother described Rao as monsters that slaughtered whole villages, making huge mounds with bones of the people they killed for someone to be keeping one. Well, it'd be like a mouse keeping a cat, you know. Doesn't make sense. During the conversation, I overheard the guy or mouse. If you will mention an agreement, how does a mouse make an agreement with a cat, a hungry cat? Do you think he has a magic weapon or something, maybe a necklace that allows him to control it? Bren paused and stared at Tesh curiously, then shook her head. How did you come up with? Never mind. No, I don't think there's a magic medallion. But if the Rao was in a prison, how did it get out? Perhaps it was let out. Maybe that's when they made the agreement. You know, I do this for you, you do that for me. So the mouse freed the cat on the promise that it wouldn't eat him. Well, sure, but the mouse would want more than that. After all, leaving the cat in the Durjan would take care of that. The mouse would want something more, like what something a Rao would agree to, something it would like to do anyway. Kill lots of mice. That night when I heard them talking, one of them said something about waiting for spring. Nephren thinks the Fray will attack in spring. That might not be a coincidence. It's spring right now. Tesh told her. You know that, right? They continued walking down the steep sloping street of paving stones, past dozens of buildings with lit candles and closed drapes. Frey were inside, and Bryn wondered if they were peeking out watching them pass. What did they do in there? And how did they feel about all the ruins running free on their streets? You said Merrill lives on Yolanda Hill. Tesh nodded. So he's a Frey then? Actually no, he's a human, was a slave like Malcolm. Seemed like he inherited the house when Xinyan died. Oh, Bryn said, then sighed. What's wrong? Well, if Merrill was a Frey, then I could see him wanting to release a Rouse to devour all the humans right as the elven army arrives. Great plan. Horrible and unimaginably evil, sure, but still pretty smart. But a human slave wouldn't want that. Merrill's on our side. I'm not so sure. Tesh said, I think he liked being a slave. Malcolm said Merrill saw himself as one of them. And while a lot of the free loyalists, at least the non-in-stereo ones, packed up and went back across the Nidwalden when we moved in, a human slave wouldn't be able to do that, no matter how much they want to be afraid. Really? Bryn bit her lip. Is it me, or is this starting to make sense? What do you mean? I'm starting to think that Merrill really could be planning on letting this roll loose. But how can I get Persephone to believe that we need proof? Tesh said, I know where Merrill's house is. I'll go have a look. I'll go right now. You mean we'll go? Tish gave her a serious look. No, I mean I'll go. If you're right, Bryn, this could be really dangerous. She frowned, nodding. I know that more than you believe me. That's why I can't let you go alone. She looked at the two swords on his hips and recalled the sparring bouts in the courtyard. What do you think? Can you defeat a Raw? Maybe we should. Tesh straightened up and placed hands on the pummels of his weapons. With these I'm better than anyone, but Sabek, I can handle a single row, so what's the problem? Then Tesh conceded. Okay, fine. Let's go visit Mr. Merrill and see if he really does have a guest. Unfamiliar with that section of the city, Bryn followed Tesh. She watched him stop and pivot around more than once. The streets in the city of Wrists were a haphazard maze, the houses packed close and set on tiers such that Tesh often looked down at a street he wanted to get to, but he saw no means to reach it. Bryn was starting to worry that they wouldn't be able to find the place when Tesh abruptly stopped. That's it, Tesh said. He was pointing at a home with a sword and shield for a door knocker. We walked by this twice. She told him yes, but from the other direction, Tess explained. But Bryn didn't think that explained anything. By then, all the other homes had lights burning. This made Meryl's house stand out all the more. The place was dark. "Do you think it's empty, abandoned?" Ben asked. Tesh pointed at the flower boxes under the windows. "Nope, someone has been taking care of those." "And why so dark?" "I think there are blankets over the windows," Tesh said. "The fray. Call those drapes," Bryn explained. "Have them in the place I live to. They're nice, but they don't block out all the light. If lamps were lit, you could see it." "Is it possible no one's home?" "Could be, but I doubt. Meryl takes it for walks. Probably just likes it dark to round. Need light?" "I don't think so. The one that grabbed me didn't. I think it could see just fine in the dark." She looked at his swords again. "Those might not be as useful when you're blind." Tesh grinned at her. "I think you'd be surprised." This should have made her feel better, and it did sort of, but Bryn could still remember the feel of that hand on her face, strong, cold, and damp. The long, bony fingers squeezed her cheeks, and she had felt the sharp points on its fingertips. "Really, you're that good enough to only be concerned about you?" Another warm flush bloomed on her cheeks. She was glad it was dark. "So what's the plan?" Tesh asked. "How about we knock?" Tesh raised his brows. "Best advantage in battle is surprise. This isn't a battle. I think we should start by speaking to this Meryl fellow, challenging him, even ask to search his house. If he refuses or acts suspiciously, then we can go back and tell Persephone." Tesh shrugged. "Okay, we'll do it your way." He knocked. There were a few faint, unseen voices speaking in fray down the street. Funny, she thought, how sounds carried in the night in ways they didn't during the day. Bryn rarely saw or even heard the natives in whose homes they lived. The fray were excellent at hiding. They came out at night, after the streets were empty. For some time, Bryn had been convinced the fray could see better in the dark than humans. They were certainly faster and more agile on occasion. She thought she saw one out of the corner of an eye, but when she turned, all she saw was a shadow. She thought of them as ghost spirits that she heard at night. She imagined they came to the ruined district in the late hours and gathered to complain about how the ruins were ruining the place. The idea of them coming out at night made her think all of them were a kind of row standing in the street in the dark in a populated phrase section of the city. Bryn knew this was a place she shouldn't be. Am I insane? She thought. Maybe almost 9 months had passed since she was taken, and she was still having nightmares. The row hadn't so much as bruised her, but it had left her broken. As a little girl, Bryn used to be afraid of the dark, and her mother had let her fall asleep with the lamp burning, a costly custom to ease a child's fear. Bryn had forced herself to face it, to lie stiff in her bed, shivering, listening to every creak or gust of wind, waiting for she never knew exactly what the next morning she felt. Free. Bryn was hoping something like that would happen with the row, that she would grit her teeth, face it, and finally be free. Even so, Bryn wouldn't have gone to this house alone. "I might be insane, but I'm not crazy," she had pretended ignorance. When speaking to Tesh, she had spent all winter watching him train. She knew he was a superb warrior. Bryn couldn't have a better protector, and yet the last time it took a dragon. No, she thought, a Galara. Bryn. No one answered the door. Tesh rapped again. They waited. Nothing. Bryn sighed. "I guess we'll have to come back. You should wait here." Tesh told her. "Wait? What do you mean wait? It will be safer." Tesh lifted the latch, and laying a hand on a sword, he pushed the door open. "You can't go in. No one is home." "I know, that's why you can't go in." Tesh looked at her, puzzled. "It's probably listening to you." This shut her up, and Bryn clamped both hands to her face. Tesh disappeared over the threshold, leaving Bryn on the doorstep, terrified. She stared after him into the darkness. It looked like a pit, a tunnel into some horrible void. Tish was walking into a monster's nest. She waited and waited, when felt as if she had stood there a month, maybe 2, and in all that time she never moved, didn't breathe, and would have bet the year's sweet crop that her heart never beat once. She held herself rigid, staring into the dark hole of the house, listening. Tesh was quiet and as nimble as a fray. Still, she heard some sounds, a faint rustle, then the creak of a board. More waiting, no more sounds. The quiet is good. I'd hear a struggle if he's attacked. And yet, what if it grabbed him from behind? Rao are good at that. It could have him right now, that horrible hand on his mouth preventing him from making a sound. Her heart was beating after all. How could she not have noticed the pounding in her chest? "I can't just wait here." She took a step across the threshold, but halted when a light appeared inside. It floated toward the door. An instant later she saw Tesh holding a candle on a little copper plate. With a finger ring places empty, he said. Really? He nodded. Did you go upstairs? He smirked. Of course, I went upstairs. Did you find anything? Well, anything unusual? He curled his finger for her to follow and led her inside. If you didn't find anything, that's fine. I don't need to see. I'll believe you now. I think you should see for yourself. Trust me, there's no danger. No one is here. Not Meryl, not a raw. Bryn's surge of courage was quickly draining away now that Tesh wasn't having his face eaten. She didn't want to go, and everything about that house was screaming for her to keep out. They were intruding. It was dark, and there was a smell. Bryn had no idea what it was, but it wasn't nice, not really necessary. He was already halfway across the entryway, disappearing back into the dark when she gave in and chased after him. The home was in many ways like the one Bryn was living in, although not quite as nice. The place was masculine with less lace and more boots. 5 pairs of high-top leathers were set near the door. She found no stenciling vases or wall hangings. The place was sparse. No knickknacks, no plants. One thing did catch her eye. A beautiful harp stood in the far corner across from the fireplace, formed of lacquer wood that was curved and carved. The thing was as much a piece of art as an instrument. Tash took her right to the stairs. Here the smell was stronger. The scent was rancid, like rotting meat. Tash didn't pull or coax. He merely waited, watching her with sympathetic eyes. He probably thought she was a terrible coward. He'd certainly had no trouble marching through the house. Why was she so terrified? What part of they eat people's faces? Didn't you hear? Tesh said. The place was empty, but Rao, like Frey, might just be very good at hiding. Bryn clenched her fists, set her jaw, and followed Tess up the steps. As they reached the second story, Tess held the candle high so she could see the whole upper floor was one big mound of bones, long, short, thick, and then some were white, others yellowed. There were so many, a huge pile. Bryn stepped away from the banister and moved to the loft, carefully placing her feet on bare patches of floor. This is it, she thought, spellbound. The pile. Bryn stood in the midst of the mound, overwhelmed at the sight. Every bone had once been part of a person. She saw arm and leg bones, wide paddle-shaped pelvises, racks of ribs and skulls. How many has it killed? How many like me did it grab? How many screamed as it ate their faces? Then she realized the bones weren't just a pile. The arm bones were all together, each aligned in the same way. The same was true of the leg bones and the feet and hands. Every part was carefully placed in some twisted design, right down to the ring of skulls, with all the faces pointing out like watchmen. That's its bed. Those skulls keep it safe while it sleeps. Bryn, Tess said. She barely heard him. She stood frozen. Are you all right? Bryn honestly didn't know she was crying, sobbing, tears running down her cheeks as she started to say. Then she spotted the shawl. The discarded wad of cloth lay on the floor, revealed by Tesh's little candle. The wool was the traditional red pattern of green, black, and blue, and Bryn had no trouble recognizing the weaving work of her mother. She picked it up. This is Seth Shaw. Tesh picked up a shimmering blue and gold cloak. This is Nefer's. Meryl stole them. Why? Bryn's eyes went wide. Meryl isn't going to use the root to kill a bunch of people. He's targeting specific ones. Come on, we need to go. Bryn was already moving down the stairs. I know why it's not here, and I know where it's going to be. Chapter 15. Through a narrow window. Most people like windows, but I think they look like eyes, soulless eyes that invite things. A bolted door is meant to keep out. Yeah, it is probably just me. Well, and Persephone, the book of Bryn. Persephone sat in the quiet of her bedroom, rubbing the silver ring that hung from the chain around her neck. Reglan's ring. She tried to remember who had given it back to her. Conger had been wearing it when he died. Someone must have delivered it after burying him, but she couldn't remember who. Taupe maybe, or Whedon, or no, it was Tressa. Persephone nodded to the stars outside the open window across from her bed. Yes, it was Tressa. She had dutifully delivered the chieftain's ring. How could I have forgotten that tears had been in Tressa's eyes, her cheeks worn river beds from facing the loss of a husband. Persephone knew what that felt like. Persephone had lied, telling everyone that Conger died while hunting the bear. No need to speak ill of the dead or embarrass the living, but word had escaped. Word always got around in a dull. Persephone had no idea how Tressa learned the truth, or who might have told her. Maybe Tressa herself couldn't accept that her husband was a martyr and had asked questions. Tressa knew the truth, and yet she still brought the ring. Tressa was a bitch, but she was no coward. The silver ring that had lived on Persephone's husband's hand for more than 20 years was all she had left. Some of that silver had been tarnished. Reglan had given Maeve a daughter, then ordered her taken away to die in the forest to hide his transgression. The man she'd loved unconditionally for 20 years, the man she'd trusted, had done more than just deceive her. He'd been a monster, killed a child, or thought he had. Such an idea was difficult to reconcile. Such tarnish was impossible to remove. She drew the ring off the chain and held it up in the flickering light of the candle that rested on the little table. It had been a year. The mourning was over. I know. You loved me, she told the circle of silver, and I still love you no matter what you did. Can't stop, that can't make it not be. And she swallowed hard. And I miss you so very badly. Still remember how you smelled, you know. That a tear slipped rolling down her cheek. She let it fall. We were a great team, you and I. She bit her lip. And it's stupid, the things I keep thinking of, the way you bounce your foot at meetings, or the silly sound of your laugh. I sometimes think I hear it in a crowd. I look, but it's never you. She drew in a shaky breath. Things have changed. Persephone was alone in her room, isolated high in the crypt, surrounded by several feet of fray quarried stone. There was only the one narrow window, and it faced away from the rest of the wrist. The door to the bedroom was closed. No one could hear. Still, the words were hard to say. She needed to hear them, needed to say them out loud, to make it real. And maybe Reglan was listening. She hoped so, because she needed to. Explain. Things are different now that you're gone. You understand that, right? You were always so practical. And I'm the Koenig now, yeah, can you believe that? Me, Koenig. She let out a little miserable laugh. I have responsibilities, things I have to do. You taught me that. She let the ring slip into her palm. Where she squeezed it, she closed her eyes and more tears fell. I forgive you, she said in a whisper, but the words were loud in her heart. I forgive you, my love. I hope you can do the same for me. She reached out her arm, opened her hand, and let the ring drop. She heard the small circlet hit the floor and roll away. Goodbye, Reglan, she cried, then deep and hard into the palms of her hands. After what felt like a long time, she wiped her face and took a breath. She felt exhausted, all the muscles in her body sore and weak as if she'd been in a fight, and she felt empty and alone, so very alone. She sat with her eyes closed and head back, listening to herself breathe. Then she opened her eyes and screamed. Bryn was known for being a fast runner, but she hadn't been training daily for nearly a year the way Tesh had. She had slowed down to an air-gasping walk by the time they reached the second gate. That was where he finally caught up to her. Keep going, she waved at him. Tesh didn't bother wasting air replying. He couldn't run, but he could still jog. Right behind you, he heard her say as he passed by. She still had a terrified look. At first, Tesh didn't understand how those two pieces of clothes meant anything. So Meryl was a thief who cared about that when he was harboring a monster. Brian hadn't bothered to explain. She just bolted. Tesh finally put it together when they reached the steps to the first gate where the Ascendaw kept their kennel of hunting dogs. Meryl was going to use his pet to assassinate the leaders of the rebellion, but Persephone was in the crypt, the safest place in an impregnable fortress. Even Wraith couldn't get in there without an invitation. But could a row in the long dark of a Dorian winter's night? The older villagers told stories, tales recited by parents. Being Dorian, the stories were never pleasant, but always tales of woe and warning. The legend of the row was typical, roaming hills and forests deep on human bones. It makes its bed, but weary row cannot sleep till once again the pile is fed. It prowls beyond the fire's light. Warrior, hunter, girl and boy, the rouse savors every bite. A succulent face the monster's joy stare clear of. Lonely hills at night, the sunset shadows. You must race. The row's grip is oh so tight as deeply she bites into your face. Tash charged the last steps to the Vention, following the spiral steps that circled the inside wall and spilled out to the long corbel bridge. A quick final sprint, and Tesh reached the kite. Open up. Tesh hammered on the door. He bent over, supporting himself with his hands on his knees, and took deep, luxurious breaths. I need to see the Kennick. The little door in the door opened and a pair of eyes peered out. Too late. Come back in the morning, Cat, it's urgent. Who are you? Tesh of the Drya. Try coming back tomorrow. But you don't understand. I have to see the Kennick. She's already gone to bed. I don't care. This is important. Did Wraith send you? Wraith? No. Then why do you need to see the Kennick? Because Tekla Tash heard a familiar voice behind him. Turning, he spotted Sabek coming out of the Varention and walking toward him across the narrow bridge. Sabek. He shouted with relief, "I thought I saw you run up here. I was hoping to catch you below. But you went right by me." Sabek was dressed in his breastplate and shoulder guards. His bronze armor was customized, smaller, thinner, and lighter than the others. Even so, he rarely wore it. Even in sparring matches, he always complained that the metal sheets were hot in the sun. "Yeah, listen, you need to help me. I plan to trust." Look at him, surprised. Did Bryn already talk to him? Smart girl. He hooked a thumb at the door where the little window had already slid shut. "This idiot won't let me in." Spec approached quickly, drawing thunder and lightning. For a confused moment, Tesh couldn't make the connection. Is he going to use his swords on the door? How will that help? What are you doing? The Frey smiled. "Time for another lesson." "Didn't Bryn tell you you need to defend yourself?" Sabek closed the distance and attacked. Tesh dodged the blow purely out of instinct and spun solely out of reflex. Then he drew iron from both scabbards. "This is no time for a lesson." Sabek grinned. "When did you look like a long run? Can't expect enemies to be courteous and only attack when you're prepared. Sometimes they catch you off guard in awkward places where you can't retreat." He attacked again, and Tesh noticed something different in his assault. He imagined no one else in the world would have noticed. But after so many bouts, Tesh knew Sabek's technique. This wasn't it. The attack was more aggressive, more dead on, and it was faster. Tesh intercepted the blades and thanked Roan and the gods for the iron swords. Anything less would have given way. As it was, he felt the bone-jarring impact that nearly kicked them from his hands in the past. That's what always happened. But Tesh had learned a new grip and a new way of deflecting a straight edge-to-edge stroke, sparing him the loss of his weapons. He saw the look of surprise on Sabek's face when he didn't lose his blades, and Tesh took that moment to strike back and to shout, "Stop it, we need to save." That was all the time he had before Sabek came at him again. He swung straight on. No one ever did that. They all learned not to swing a death blow. Instead, they were taught to angle the stroke so that a missed follow-through wouldn't kill. Sabek was breaking that rule. If Tesh fails to block, lightning would cleave him in half. What's more, Sabek was stepping in, putting excess force into the blows. What's he trying to do? Kill me? None of that bothered Tesh too much. Sabek, unlike the other trainers, didn't coddle. He pushed and pushed hard. Famous for wounding students, Sabek had always upped the level of threat every time they fought. This was just another level. Tesh might have been flattered by the respect of no quarter shown, and he would have, except for one thing. Sabek wasn't smiling. Sabek always grinned in battle. The Frey loved combat, and the better the fight, the more he grinned. At times, he'd even laugh. This was proving to be a very good fight, but Sabek wasn't laughing, wasn't grinning, wasn't smiling. Sabek looked miserable. Flashing metal jolted as Tesh caught another stroke. Sabek spun. Crash came the second blade, lightning followed by thunder. Sabek had never explained the names. After fighting him, he didn't need to flash. Crash. The attacks came faster and faster, call and answer, and Tesh was tired from the run. He had built up stamina, but not this much. He was finding it hard to breathe, and Sabek wasn't giving him a chance to catch his breath. "What are you doing?" Tesh heard Bryn's voice. "Stop it." She was behind Sabek, and the Frey instantly pulled back and whirled to face her. "Get out of our way." Bryn stood on the bridge. Sabek had one blade facing Tash and one extended, pointing at Bryn. For a flash of an instant, Tash sensed death. He could smell it, feel it radiating off his mentor. Sabek would stab Bryn through the heart, a clean, fast blow that wouldn't alter his stance, allowing him to parry any retaliation from Tesh. All of this was so clear, so obvious. Tesh was seeing 3 moves ahead and witnessing an unspeakable horror. Like any wild thing, the true nature of the Frey revealed itself. Then it was gone. The flash this time wasn't answered. Lightning wasn't followed by thunder. Sabek's shoulders relaxed and his weight shifted to a neutral stance. Bryn pushed past the Frey, shoving him back against the stone wall. As she barreled on, Sabek didn't move. He watched her, and then Tesh, still no smile, reaching the door. Bryn hammered on the bronze with all her might. "Open up." The window opened. "Who is Bryn? If you don't open this tealing witch of a door in the next 2 seconds." That's when they heard the screaming. Persephone screamed as she watched the thing come in through the window, pale as the dead, long and lanky, and with black oily hair that hung to the floor. Seeing it, staring at it, Persephone still couldn't understand how it was getting through such a Narrow opening mice did the same thing, squeezed themselves down like that, but this wasn't a mouse Persephone had seen its like before, and backed away in horror. She bumped the bed with the backs of her thighs. "I need to get out of here," she spun, and ran for the door, grasping the latch. Persephone lifted and shoved the door unlatched, then hit something, and refused to open any farther. "Help," she screamed out the little crack. "No one is coming," the Rao told her, its voice the sound of snapping bones and hissing snakes. The thing was still squeezing through the window, oozing inside. The fleshy goo of its body revealed to be a boneless bag of skin. Get away," it whispered. "Help someone, anyone, open this damn door," she shouted again. She rammed the door with her shoulder, hurting herself. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Rao used a sing-song tone. Its head and shoulders were already in the thing, busily working on getting its hips through, twisting and pushing against the walls. "If it gets all the way and I'm dead," Persephone wished for the dwarven sword she'd once carried, but settled for its a foot long four-pronged brass candle holder. "Keep the sword up," she heard Moya's voice. "Hold it back like this. Keep your left foot in front. And when that thing comes at you, step forward with your right as you swing across the room." The Rao grinned, revealing jagged teeth. The thing was drooling. Long strings of anticipation glistened from its lips. Its red eyes glowed bright and wide with excitement as it stared at her. Yes, such a beautiful, succulent face. With candelabra in hand, she charged. A good swing struck its head, but instead of hearing a satisfying crack, Persephone felt like she'd hit a bag of sand. She never got a second swing. Clawed hands struck fast as snakes. Persephone didn't feel the pain. Not much, just a sting. She actually said "ow," which was an absurd utterance given the amount of blood that followed. She backed away. The candelabra fell out of her hand. She hadn't let go, didn't mean to at least, but she'd heard the metal ring when it hit the floor. Persephone hit the floor to her legs had folded on their own. 1 minute she was standing, the next she was sitting with her back up against the bed. She clutched her stomach as a dull but growing pain spread. She wanted to get up, but her legs wouldn't have it. Something else. Her nightgown clung slick to her skin. "How did I get so wet?" Her nightgown was shredded, the ivory cloth no longer white. Persephone wanted to scream again, but couldn't find any air. She wanted to get up and run to the door, but her legs refused to do anything more than slide around in the slippery puddle that formed beneath her. The only thing she could do was sit and watch as the Rao continued to ooze through the little window. An outstretched and bony hand extended into the room, straining with grasping claws, reaching for Persephone's face. "So soft, so sweet, so hungry. Don't move, I can taste you already." Reaching the 4th floor, Tesh saw 2 spears blocking the corridor. They might have fallen that way if there was any reason for 2 spears to have been left in the corridor. The pair of poles leaned at an angle, the points digging into the wood of the Kank's chamber door, bracing it shut. Tesh was out front with Bryn right behind. Sabek, who couldn't know the importance of the race, followed a close third. Others were coming to. Tesh heard the rapid footfalls of a dozen people, but they were far below and still had to climb the stairs. Without effort, Tesh cleaved through the spears, freeing the door. "Stay back," he shouted to Bryn as he flung the door wide. Inside, Kneek, Persephone sat slumped near her bed. Coming in that window was a ghoulish creature with red eyes, clawed hands, and black hair. Raw, the thing was about halfway through the narrow opening, still trapped at the hips, a single outstretched hand reaching for the keychain. The Rao looked up first at Tesh, then its eyes bulged when seeing Sebek. Its lips snarled, and with a hiss and one final swipe for Persephone that missed, the beast began to retreat. Tesh stared in amazement, the way he'd once watched a snake swallow a whole mouse. That's impossible, he thought, watching the Rao melt back out the window, almost like it doesn't have bones. Sabek didn't seem impressed in the least. Without hesitation, he leapt toward the window, drawing lightning and thunder as he went. The Rao shivered and jerked as it struggled to escape. Too late, Tesh thought the thing was trapped, caught as a rabbit in a snare, and Sabek was on it. Tesh expected a quick death, for the Rao lightning and thunder were coming, and the Rao wasn't big and didn't look too strong. If anything, the creature resembled a shriveled old woman, just as Tesh would have done. Sabek thrust a straightforward stab. There was no need to complicate things, but to Tesh's surprise, the Rao slapped the blade away. Its long nails made a teeth-grinding scrape across the bronze blade, then fast as an adder it swiped with the other hand, forcing Sabek to block, and then it was gone. The Rao slithered through the opening with a grunt and fell out of sight. Sabek stared at the vacant window. Kalina Bradis, he shouted and slapped the stone wall, turning. The Frey glanced at Persephone. She's hurt. Tesh didn't need Sabek to tell him that, neither did Bryn. Oh dear Mara, she cried. The Russian feet reached the stairs, and seconds later Moya entered, her bow strung, an arrow fitted. What happened? We heard, saying Persephone. She froze and dropped the bow. She shouted at Bryn, get Pedera. With a quivering hand over her mouth, Bryn backed away in wide-eyed horror. Moya, she said in a pleading tone. Moya, she's go now, get Pedera, run. Bryn blinked, nodded, then flew out the door. We have a healer here on the wrist, Sabek said calmly. He's good, get him. Sabek strode out of the bedroom, leaving Tesh to watch as Moya fell to her knees beside Persephone and applied pressure to the gaping wound. The Kinnig's eyes were open, staring at nothing. Her mouth hung agape, but she made no sound. Persephone was soaked in blood, her nightgown trapping puddles in its folds. She was breathing. That was good. That was about all. That was good. Moira put an arm around the queen, helping to hold up her head, which had flopped to one side. Moira, Persephone said in a soft voice. Her eyes found the woman's face, and a small smile appeared. I'm here. I'm too damn late, but I'm here. Moya held Persephone's head with both hands, focusing on her eyes. Tish wondered if she did that to help the keynote see her, or to avoid looking at all the blood. I'm hurt, Persephone informed Moya. I know, I'm sorry I wasn't here. I was told someone said you wanted me downstairs. I didn't even know you'd gone to bed. I'm hurt, Moya, real bad. I think. Persephone's head was bobbing up as her body jerked. You're gonna, Moya swallowed. You're gonna be fine. You're gonna be all right, okay? We're gonna take care of you. You're crying, the Kneek told her. Am I? Moya asked. I'm sorry, Moya, Persephone said. I don't think I'm going to shut up. Moya yelled at her so loudly and violently that it startled everyone in the room, everyone except Persephone. Yes, you are, damn it, you're going to be fine. You hear me? Moya hugged the Kennick's head to her neck and kissed her hair. Don't even think that way, don't you even? You're strong, damn it. You crossed the sea. You led us to victory against Belgarath. You killed a bear with a pissant little shield. You can beat this. I'm bleeding. I don't care. More guards entered the room. Both Frey and human, each wore solemn masks of worry. Tesh moved toward the window to get out of their way. Standing in front of it, he put his own head to the opening that was too narrow to allow it to pass. He looked down. It was quite a fall. But what if it hadn't fallen? What if it wasn't dead? Was it on its way back to Meryl's house? From outside, he heard a loud ringing chime. Tesh had never heard that before. Must be an alarm. News of the attack must have spread. Frey he had never seen before entered the bedroom. He actually looked old, with a gray receding hairline and a few wrinkles. How old does a Frey have to be to look like that? He barked an order in Frey, then switched to runic. Get her up on the bed. He had a bag with him that he placed beside her. So what do we have here? Severe lacerations. And oh, what? Moya asked. The healer dug into his bag. I need water. And I need that gown off right now. Dylan, get water, Moya told one of the Frey as she began to untie the Kennick's nightgown. Then she saw Tesh standing next to the window. Tesh, out, the rest of you to stand guard outside. We don't need spectators. Tesh left the room outside. The corridor was crowded with more people, most of the faces. He didn't know. What if it isn't dead? And if it isn't, if it's starving, would it really just leave? We found a shawl and a cloak. Tesh shot up the stairs, taking the steps 3 at a time until he landed on the top floor where Nephron's personal quarters were. Tesh had pointed it out once, but Tesh had never been inside. He didn't wait, didn't pause or knock. Tesh pulled the latch and walked inside. The Galantian leader wasn't there. The room had no bed, just tables, chairs, a fireplace, and a rack of weapons. Snifrin had a lot of weapons. Also hanging on the walls were shields, swords, spears, and helms. Such wealth was impossible for a Dran to imagine, and Snifrin used them as decorations. There were 2 more doors, so the bed must be in one of the other rooms. Well, what are you doing in here? Nephron asked. Tesh squirmed to see his lordship come in from the hallway, dressed only in a robe and sandals. He appeared more irritated than surprised. He also looked in a hurry. Front gate, sergeant. How many are there? Just the one, I think. 1. Nephron looked at Tesh like he was insane. What do you mean 1? They don't ring the bell for 1. The bell, they don't. Nephron pushed past him and started to enter the room on the right. Then Nephron stopped and looked back at Tesh. What's their position? Their position? Tesh asked, baffled. Nephron stared at him incredulously. Why are you up here if you don't know anything? The leader of the Galantians' eyes shifted to Tesh's sword behind Nephron. The interior of the room was dark, and the candles from the sitting room cast a sliver of light, just enough to reveal the corner of a bed Tesh saw movement he drew. Both swords in charge would our Nifrin dodged to one side. With usual fray speed, Tesh ran through, kicking the door wide open. The Rao was there, caught in the lamplight. The thing hissed and lashed out with both claws. The Rao was faster than Sebek and no longer trapped. Out of my way, it hissed. Need the one that smells of thistles and lies. The Rao raked at Tesh again. He got his blades up to save a slashing, but the force threw him against the wall. It lunged at Nefrin, the leader of the Galantians, clad in his bathrobe and sandals, was caught off balance. Tesh sympathized. No one over the age of 7 expects a Rao in their bedroom. Tesh didn't have many options, and as stupid as it felt, he did the only thing he could. He threw a sword at the creature. This wasn't a technique taught in the courtyard, and it showed. The sword slapped the Rao on the back, not at an angle that could have cut it, but the force was enough to catch its attention. Only a split second was bought, but for a fray that was plenty. Nefrin leapt back. He retreated out of his room into the hallway. But the starved rower raced after you. The thing's voice went shrill with recognition. Yes, you. And that other one. I'm out free again. Oh yes, and hungry. A feast, a banquet I will have this day. Before I sleep. Tash followed outside the room's doorway. Nefrin crouched like a wrestler, looking nervous as the Rouse salivated and curled its claws. Such a sweet-looking face. Then the creature stopped at sight, drawn to the stairs.